Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Elliot had been driving for hours, the endless stretch of highway growing more monotonous. With each passing mile, the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple. His old sedan hummed along the empty road, the only sound the occasional creak of the tires against the asphalt. He hadn't planned on getting lost, but after a long day of driving through unfamiliar territory, the signs had become increasingly sparse, and the GPS on his phone had given up. It wasn't the first time he'd found himself off the beaten path, but this felt different. The road had narrowed, winding through dense woods that seemed to close in on him with every turn. The trees, thick with age, stood like silent sentinels, their branches twisted in unnatural angles. A thick fog had started to roll in, creeping along the ground like a living thing. Elliot squinted through the windshield, trying to make out anything ahead. The world felt strangely still, as if time itself had slowed down. He checked his phone again, but there was no signal. He cursed under his breath, considering his options. He could either turn back, retracing his steps to the last town he passed, or press on and hope for the best. It wasn't like he had anywhere to be. Not really. The idea of finding a quiet, secluded place to rest for the night seemed appealing. Maybe there would be a small inn or a gas station, something to break the isolation. As if on cue, a sign appeared on the side of the road, half hidden by the fog. The letters were faded, but the name was still legible, Hallowbrook. Well, it's something, Elliot muttered to himself. He glanced at the clock, almost midnight. There wasn't much choice now. He had no intention of driving through the night, and the town was close enough to make it worth checking out. He turned the wheel, his headlights illuminating the narrow road that led into the heart of the town. Hallowbrook wasn't much to look at. The town appeared as if it had been stuck in time, its buildings aged but well-maintained, like a living diorama of a bygone era. The streets were narrow, with cobblestone paths winding between old brick houses that looked like they belonged to another century. The air was thick with mist, and a quiet unease hung in the air, as if the town were holding its breath. Elliot parked near the center of the town square, where a large, weathered clock tower loomed over the buildings. The clock face was cracked, and the hands had long since stopped moving, frozen at an hour Elliot couldn't quite make out. The town was eerily quiet, with no cars in sight, no people walking the streets, and no sounds of life at all. The only movement came from the mist, which swirled around the cobblestones, as though the town itself were alive. He stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at his skin. He looked around, feeling an odd sense of being watched, though there was no one in sight. The silence was suffocating, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the town was holding some dark secret. But there was something else too, something strangely welcoming. It was as if the town had been waiting for him. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman with silver-gray hair and a warm, yet unsettling smile. She was dressed in a long, faded dress that seemed out of place in the modern world. "Lost, are we?" she asked, her voice soft but with an odd edge to it. Elliot nodded, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in his stomach. "Yeah, I'm looking for a place to stay for the night. I didn't expect to find a town out here." "You've come to the right place," the woman said, her smile widening. "My name's Martha. I run the bed and breakfast down the street. It's not much, but it's comfortable enough for a weary traveler like yourself." Elliot hesitated for a moment. The town was strange, no doubt about it, but it wasn't exactly dangerous looking. He could always leave in the morning after a good night's sleep. "Thanks," he said, forcing a smile. "I'd appreciate that." Martha nodded and gestured toward the street. "Right this way. It's just a few blocks down." As he followed her, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that the town was watching him, that every creak of the old buildings and every whisper of the fog held some hidden meaning. He glanced around again, but the street was still empty. There was no sign of life anywhere. and the only sound was the soft shuffle of his shoes against the cobblestones. Martha led him to a small, two-story building tucked between two larger, more imposing houses. The windows were dark, but a faint light flickered in the upstairs room, casting long shadows on the street. She unlocked the door and gestured for him to enter. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The foyer was decorated with old, mismatched furniture and faded photographs of people Elliot didn't recognize. A large, ornate clock hung on the wall, its ticking the only sound in the otherwise still room. "Make yourself at home," Martha said, her voice warm but strangely hollow. "I'll fix you some tea. It's a bit late for dinner, but I'm sure you could use something to settle in." Elliot nodded, though he wasn't sure how much tea would help. He still felt uneasy, but the exhaustion from his long drive was starting to catch up with him. He took a seat in one of the armchairs, glancing around the room. The photographs on the walls seemed to be from different eras, but they all had one thing in common. They featured the same group of people. The same faces frozen in time. Martha returned a few moments later with a steaming cup of tea. She handed it to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "There's something special about this town," she said, settling into a chair across from him. "It has a way of keeping things safe. We don't get many visitors, but when we do, they always seem to find their way here." Elliot took a sip of the tea, trying to mask his discomfort. "I can see that. It's quiet. Almost too quiet." Martha chuckled softly. "Yes, it can seem that way, but that's the charm of Hallowbrook. It's a place where time doesn't rush, where people can live in peace, without the distractions of the outside world." Elliot's mind wandered, and he glanced at the clock on the wall again. It had stopped, its hands frozen in place, as if the town itself were suspended in time. This sets the tone for the eerie atmosphere of the town and introduces the protagonist's initial unease. You can continue expanding on this setup by introducing more strange occurrences, developing the mystery of the town, and gradually revealing the dark truth behind Hallowbrook. Elliot spent the next few hours trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him. Martha had been kind, offering him tea and light conversation, but there was something unsettling about her presence. Her smile, though warm, never quite reached her eyes, and her movements were a little too deliberate, as if she were performing a well-rehearsed routine. The silence of the town pressed in on him, suffocating in its stillness. After a while, Martha excused herself to attend to other matters, leaving Elliot alone in the dimly lit parlor. He sat back in the armchair, staring at the photographs on the wall. The faces of the people in the pictures seemed to watch him, their eyes following his every movement. There were no children in any of the photos, only adults, all of them looking older than they should, as if frozen in time. The longer he looked, the more uneasy he became. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, peering out into the fog-covered streets. The town was eerily quiet, with no movement in sight. No lights flickered in the houses. No sounds of life echoed from the streets. It was as if Hallowbrook had been abandoned. Yet the buildings were perfectly intact, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. He shook his head, trying to dispel the unease that clung to him. He needed to rest. He had been on the road for too long, and a good night's sleep was what he needed to clear his head. Martha had shown him to his room upstairs, small but cozy enough. The bed was old, with a heavy quilt that smelled faintly of lavender, just like the tea. The walls were adorned with more photographs, each one featuring the same group of people, all of them dressed in old-fashioned clothing. Elliot undressed and slipped into the bed, pulling the thick quilt over his body. The warmth of the bed was a welcome relief from the chill that had settled in his bones. As he closed his eyes, he tried to push the strange thoughts from his mind, but they lingered like shadows in the corners of his consciousness. Elliot's sleep was restless. Every time he closed his eyes, he was pulled into a dream that felt more like a memory that wasn't his own. He found himself standing in the middle of the town square, surrounded by the same people from the photographs. Their faces were blank, their eyes empty, staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The fog was thick, swirling around their feet, and the air was heavy with an oppressive silence. A bell tolled in the distance, and the townspeople began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they circled around him, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Elliot tried to speak, to ask them what was happening, but his voice caught in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't escape. The clock tower in the distance began to chime, its sound deep and resonant, reverberating through his chest. As the chimes grew louder, the people in the circle began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic. The words were incomprehensible, a language he couldn't understand, but they felt ancient, old, like something that had been passed down through generations. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet gave way, and he was falling into darkness. Elliot woke with a start, his heart racing in his chest. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. He sat up, gasping for breath, his mind still reeling from the dream. It had felt so real, so vivid. The faces of the townspeople, the chanting, the feeling of being trapped, it all lingered in his mind, like a weight pressing down on him. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, trying to steady his breathing. The clock on the wall ticked softly, and the silence of the room felt suffocating. He glanced around, but everything was still, too still. The dream had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He had to get out of this town. The feeling of being watched, the strange, unwelcoming atmosphere, was all too much. But as he stood, preparing to leave the room, he heard something, a soft tapping at the door. His heart skipped a beat. "Elliot," came a voice, muffled through the wood. "Are you awake?" It was Martha's voice, gentle and calm, but there was something strange about the way she said his name. It was as if she already knew he was awake, as if she had been waiting for him. "Yeah," Elliot called back, his voice hoarse. "I'm awake. What is it?" There was a brief pause before she spoke again. "I thought you might like some company. It's a quiet night, and we don't often get visitors. Why don't you come downstairs for some tea? It'll help you sleep." Elliot hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to spend more time in this unsettling town, but the offer of tea was hard to resist. Maybe talking to someone would help clear his head, shake off the remnants of the dream. "Sure," he said finally. "I'll be down in a minute." Elliot made his way downstairs, the wooden stairs creaking under his weight. The house was eerily quiet, and the air felt thick with an unspoken tension. As he entered the parlor, Martha was sitting by the fireplace, her silver-gray hair gleaming in the firelight. She smiled at him, but the smile seemed a little too wide, a little too knowing. "Please have a seat," she said, gesturing to the armchair across from her. "I thought we could talk." Elliot sat down, still feeling the weight of the dream pressing on him. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. He trailed off, unsure of how to explain the strange feelings that had been building ever since he arrived. "No need to apologize," Martha said softly. "It's not often we have visitors. People tend to avoid Hallowbrook for one reason or another. But I suppose you've already noticed that, haven't you?" Elliot looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "The silence," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way time seems to stand still here. It's all part of the town's charm, you could say. We've been here for a long time, and some of us are content to stay. But not everyone, of course." Elliot frowned. "What do you mean, not everyone?" Martha's smile faded slightly, her eyes darkening. "There are those who come to Hallowbrook looking for something. They think they can leave, but they never do. You're not the first to try." Elliot felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" She leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "You've seen the clock tower, haven't you? The one with the broken hands? It's more than just an old clock. It's a symbol of the town's condition. We're all trapped here, Elliot. Trapped in a cycle, unable to leave." Elliot's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what she was saying. "Trapped? What do you mean? I just got here." "I'm not." "You're already part of it," Martha interrupted, her tone sharp now. "You've been brought here for a reason, and just like the others before you, you'll never leave." Elliot stood up abruptly, his mind spinning. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is insane." Martha's eyes darkened. Is it? Or is it the truth? Think about it, Elliot. You've already tried to leave, haven't you? And yet, here you are. Elliot froze. She was right. He had tried to leave earlier, but the town had always seemed to pull him back. The road had never ended, no matter how far he drove. He turned toward the door, but Martha's voice stopped him. Don't go, she said softly. It's too late. You've already entered the cycle. You're part of Hallowbrook now. Elliot stood frozen in the doorway, his mind racing. Martha's words echoed in his ears, each one sinking deeper into his consciousness. You're part of Hallowbrook now. The idea seemed impossible, but the more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she might be right. He had tried to leave. He had driven for hours, and yet somehow, the town had always been there, just ahead of him, waiting. It was as though the road itself had conspired to keep him here. He turned back to face Martha, her calm demeanor unnerving in the face of his rising panic. What do you mean, part of it? I just need to leave. This isn't real. I'm not. You don't understand, Martha interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. You've crossed the threshold, Elliot. Once you enter Hallowbrook, you're bound to it. There's no escaping. It's been this way for as long as anyone can remember. Elliot's chest tightened. But how? Why? Martha's eyes darkened, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. The town has a way of drawing people in. It feeds on them, keeps them here trapped in its web. And once you're here, the cycle begins. You'll find yourself stuck in the same loop, one that repeats over and over. You'll live the same day again and again, but it will always be different. The faces will change, the people will change, but the town will always be the same. Elliot felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. What do you mean, the faces will change? Are you saying? Martha nodded slowly. The people here, they don't age. They don't leave. They're stuck in time, just like the town. But every now and then, someone new comes, and the cycle resets. You'll find yourself reliving the same events, over and over, never able to break free. Elliot backed away from her, his heart pounding in his chest. This couldn't be happening. It didn't make sense. But as he looked around the room, the walls seemed to close in on him, the photographs of the same people staring at him with vacant eyes. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the room. No, Elliot said, shaking his head. I won't stay here. I'll find a way out. I'll drive until You can't, Martha said, her voice soft but final. The road will always lead you back. You'll drive in circles, and no matter how far you go, you'll always end up here. The town has its way of keeping you. Elliot's mind spun. He had to get out. He had to escape. He turned toward the door again, but this time, as he reached for the handle, he froze. The door wouldn't open. He tried again, pushing and pulling with all his strength, but it was as if the door had been sealed shut, locked from the outside. He pounded on it, his breath coming in short gasps, panic rising in his chest. Martha stood behind him, her expression unreadable. It's no use. The town won't let you go. Elliot spun around, his eyes wide with fear. Why are you doing this? Why are you keeping me here? Martha's face softened, a hint of sadness in her eyes. I don't want to keep you, Elliot, but I can't let you leave. Not now. Not after you've already entered the cycle. You're part of it, just like the rest of us. Elliot stumbled back, his mind reeling. He couldn't breathe. The walls of the room seemed to close in on him, the air thick and suffocating. He had to get out. He had to escape. Please, he begged, his voice trembling. I just want to leave. I just want to go home. Martha sighed, her gaze softening. I know you do, but there's no home to go back to. Not anymore. Hallowbrook is your home now. Elliot's heart sank. The weight of her words pressed down on him, and he felt a wave of despair wash over him. This couldn't be real. He couldn't be trapped here. But as the fog outside swirled around the house, and the clock ticked on, he realized with growing horror that Martha might be telling the truth. The next morning, Elliot woke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. He sat up in bed, his breath shallow and rapid. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The room was unfamiliar, but it was the same room he had slept in the night before. The same faded quilt, the same photographs on the wall. His mind raced. Had it all been a dream? Had he imagined the conversation with Martha, the terrifying revelation that he was trapped in the town? But as he looked out the window, he saw it. The same fog, the same empty streets, the same clock tower in the distance, its hands frozen in time. It was the same day. He jumped out of bed, his body trembling with fear. He rushed downstairs, his mind spinning with the realization that the cycle had begun. The same day was repeating itself, just as Martha had warned him. When he reached the parlor, Martha was sitting by the fireplace, as if nothing had changed. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Good morning, Elliot," she said, her voice calm. "Did you sleep well?" Elliot's chest tightened. This is happening again. The same day. You said it would happen, but I didn't believe you. I thought maybe I was just imagining it. Martha's smile was soft, almost pitying. It's not your fault. You're not the first to find yourself in this situation, and you won't be the last. The cycle has a way of repeating itself. You'll get used to it in time. No, Elliot said, his voice shaking. I can't do this. I can't stay here. I won't let it happen. Martha stood up, her gaze steady. You'll learn, Elliot. You'll understand soon enough. You'll see that there's no escaping Hallowbrook. It's not just the town, it's the people, the memories, the time itself. It all binds us together. And once you've crossed the threshold, there's no going back. Elliot backed away, his mind a whirlwind of panic and disbelief. No, I won't stay here. I'll find a way out. I'll drive until... You can't, Martha interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. The road will always bring you back. You'll never escape. Elliot ran for the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't accept this fate. But as he reached for the handle, he felt it again. The door was locked, sealed shut. He pounded on it with all his strength, his desperation rising. Please, let me out. But no one answered. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the door creaked open. Elliot stepped outside, gasping for air. The fog had thickened, and the town was as still as it had been the day before. The clock tower loomed in the distance, its hands frozen at the same time. He looked around, his eyes wide with disbelief. The cycle had begun again, and there was no way out. Elliot stood frozen on the threshold of the house, the door still open behind him. The fog swirled around his feet, its cold tendrils creeping up his legs as he stepped forward, but he didn't feel the chill. His mind was numb, his thoughts jumbled, the weight of his new reality pressing down on him. The town was the same as it had been yesterday. No one moved, no one spoke. The silence was suffocating, as though time had been suspended in this place, never to move forward again. He turned back to the house, half expecting to see the door slam shut behind him, but it remained wide open. The house, Martha's house, was as still and silent as the rest of the town. The only sound was the distant toll of the clock tower, marking the hour with its deep, mournful chimes. Elliot didn't know what to do. He couldn't leave. He couldn't stay. The cycle had already begun, and he was trapped in it, like a fly caught in a web. He glanced around, searching for any sign of life. There was no movement, no sign of anyone else in the streets. It was as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for him to make a move. He turned back to the road. The same road he had driven on yesterday, the same road that had led him to Hallowbrook. But this time, he didn't feel the same sense of determination. The road stretched out before him, but it felt endless, like a loop that would lead him right back to where he had started. With a deep breath, he turned and walked back toward the house. He had to find answers. He had to understand what was happening to him, to the town, to everyone who had been trapped here before him. As Elliot entered the house, he found Martha sitting in the same chair by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on him. She didn't seem surprised to see him return. "You can't escape, can you?" she asked softly, her voice almost pitying. Elliot didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. He felt like a prisoner in a nightmare, unable to wake up. "I need to understand," he said, his voice rough. Why is this happening? Why am I here? Martha's expression softened, and she gestured toward the hallway. There's a place you might find answers. The library. Elliot blinked, confused. The library? Martha nodded. It's at the heart of the town. It holds the records, the history. It's where we keep the truth, the things we don't speak of. You'll find what you need there. Elliot didn't question her further. He had to know. He had to understand how this town had come to be, and why it was trapping him in its endless cycle. He made his way through the house, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He found the library at the back of the house, a large room filled with shelves of dusty old books. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper, and the dim light from the window cast long shadows across the room. It looked like a place that hadn't been touched in years, forgotten by time. He began to search the shelves, pulling down books at random, flipping through pages filled with strange symbols and words he couldn't understand. But nothing made sense. The more he searched, the more frustrated he became. It was as if the answers were just out of reach, hidden behind layers of cryptic text. Then, in the far corner of the room, he spotted a thick, leather-bound book that seemed different from the rest. Its cover was worn and faded, and the pages looked old, yellowed with age. Something about it felt important. He pulled it from the shelf and opened it, his heart racing as he began to read. The book was a history of Hallowbrook, but it wasn't like any history he had ever read before. It was a strange, disjointed account, full of vague references and cryptic passages. But as he read, certain details began to stand out, details that made his blood run cold. Hallowbrook was founded over 200 years ago, a small settlement that had once been thriving, full of life and promise. But something had gone wrong. A curse had fallen upon the town, a curse that bound its people to it, trapping them in a never-ending cycle. The town's founder, a man named Jonathan Blackwell, had made a deal with an ancient entity, one that promised power and prosperity in exchange for the souls of the town's inhabitants. The deal had been sealed with blood, and the curse had taken root. Over the years, the people of Hallowbrook had tried to escape, but they were always pulled back. No one ever left. They were trapped in the cycle, forced to live out the same day. Over and over, their memories wiped clean each time the cycle reset. Elliot's stomach churned as he read on. The town's inhabitants were not truly alive, not in the way he understood life. They were echoes, shadows of their former selves, trapped in the town by the curse. And when someone new arrived, like him, they became part of the cycle. They were absorbed into the town, their fate sealed, their soul bound to Hallowbrook for eternity. Elliot slammed the book shut, his hands trembling. He couldn't believe what he had just read. The idea that he was now part of this cursed town, that he would never escape, was too much to bear. But as he stood there, staring at the closed book in his hands, he realized something. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break the cycle, to free himself from the town's grip. He wasn't going to give up. He couldn't. He had to find a way to escape, to destroy the curse, to free the souls trapped in Hallowbrook. But as he turned to leave the library, he heard a voice from behind him. "You can't escape, Elliot." He spun around, his heart racing. Martha was standing in the doorway, her face unreadable. "I've been trying for years," she said softly. "I've seen others try too, but the town doesn't let you go. Not once you've crossed the threshold." Elliot's hands clenched into fists. "I don't care. I'm not going to let this town trap me. I'll find a way to break the curse." Martha's expression softened, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "I admire your determination, but you'll soon see that there's no way out. The town will always pull you back." Elliot didn't answer. He couldn't. He had to find a way to escape, to break free from the cycle that held him in its grip. He had to keep fighting no matter what. The next day, Elliot stood in the town square, staring up at the clock tower. Its hands were frozen in place, stuck at midnight. The tower loomed over the town, a silent witness to the curse that had bound its people for centuries. He had to get inside. He had to understand what was keeping the cycle in motion. The clock tower had to hold the key to breaking the curse. With a deep breath, he began to walk toward it, his footsteps echoing in the empty square. The fog swirled around him, and the silence was deafening. As he reached the base of the tower, he saw the door, an old, iron door, rusted with age. It was locked, but he didn't hesitate. He pulled on the handle, and to his surprise, the door creaked open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange markings. The stairs spiraled upward, leading him toward the top of the tower. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as he climbed, each step bringing him closer to the truth. At the top of the tower, he found the mechanism that controlled the clock. It was ancient, covered in cobwebs, but it was still functional. The gears were frozen in place, just like the clock's hands. Elliot stepped forward, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch the gears. There had to be a way to make them turn, to break the cycle. He had to. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled, and the clock tower groaned as if it were coming to life. And then he heard it, a voice, low and ancient, echoing through the tower. "You cannot escape, Elliot." Elliot froze as the voice echoed through the clock tower, reverberating against the walls like the sound of distant thunder. It was low, ancient, and filled with a terrifying sense of inevitability. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned, searching for the source of the voice. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, as though something unseen was watching him, waiting. "You cannot escape, Elliot." The voice was closer now, as if it were right behind him. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, dust-filled room, the old clock mechanism, and the silent gears frozen in place. The voice spoke again, its tone cold and commanding. "You're already part of this place. There is no escape. There never was." Elliot's mind raced. The words sent a chill through his body, but he refused to let them break him. He couldn't. He wouldn't. He had come too far to give up now. "No," he said aloud, his voice trembling but defiant. "I won't accept that. I will break this cycle. I will find a way out." A low, mocking laugh filled the tower, sending a shiver down Elliot's spine. It was a laugh that held centuries of despair, of people who had tried and failed to escape the town's grip. It was a laugh that spoke of a power far beyond anything Elliot could comprehend. The voice spoke again, its tone soft, almost pitying. "You think you can break the cycle? You think you can defeat me? You are nothing but a fleeting moment, a passing soul. The town is eternal. I am eternal." Elliot's hands clenched into fists. He couldn't let this thing, this entity, control him. He couldn't let it win. He had to keep fighting. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "What is this place?" The voice was silent for a moment, as if considering his question. Then, it spoke again, its words slow and deliberate, like a story being told from the depths of time. "I am the one who made the deal," the voice said. "I am the one who cursed this town, who bound its people to me. I am the entity that lives within Hallowbrook. I am the reason you are here." Elliot's stomach churned. "You're the one who trapped everyone here. You're the one who cursed them." The voice responded with a laugh, dark and full of malice. "Yes, I am. But it was not just me. It was Jonathan Blackwell, the town's founder. He sought power, immortality. He made the deal with me, and in return, I gave him what he wanted. But there was a price that none of them understood." Elliot's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. The curse is not just about the town. It's about the people, about their souls. "Yes," the voice hissed. "Their souls are mine. And now, yours is too. You are a part of Hallowbrook. You always have been. Once you entered, you were bound to it. You cannot leave. You will never leave." Elliot felt his knees go weak as the weight of the voice's words pressed down on him. He could feel the truth of it in his bones. He was trapped. There was no way out. The entity had made. Sure of that. He was just another soul, another victim of the curse that had bound the town for centuries. But then, something stirred within him, a flicker of defiance. He had come this far. He had uncovered the truth. He couldn't let it end like this. He wouldn't let it. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he reached for the gears. The clock tower groaned, as if protesting his touch, but he ignored it. He had to try. He had to break the cycle. Elliot's fingers brushed against the cold metal of the gears, and the moment his skin made contact, the tower seemed to come alive. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that hummed through his body. The gears groaned, their movement slow at first, but then they began to turn, grinding against each other with a sound that rattled the bones. The voice in the tower grew louder, more frantic. "No, you cannot." But Elliot didn't stop. He pushed harder, his hands slipping on the greasy, rusted surface of the gears as he worked to turn them. The clock tower trembled, and the entire building seemed to shake with the force of the struggle. The hands of the clock began to move, slowly at first, then faster, ticking away the moments as if time itself were unraveling. The voice howled in rage. "You fool! You don't understand what you're doing." But Elliot didn't care. He had to finish this. He had to break the curse. With one final, desperate push, the gears clicked into place, and the clock tower let out a deafening roar. The sound was like 1,000 voices screaming in unison, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the town. And then everything stopped. The tower was silent. The gears were still. The clock's hands were frozen once more, but this time, they were no longer at midnight. They had stopped at 3 a.m. For a long moment, Elliot stood there, his chest heaving, his mind reeling. Had he done it? Had he broken the cycle? Had he freed himself from the curse? The fog outside had lifted, and the town was eerily quiet. The air felt different now, as if something had changed. Something had shifted. But was it enough? Elliot turned toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to know. He had to see if the town had truly been freed. As he stepped outside, he felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. The streets were empty, but the air felt fresh, the sky clear. For the first time since he had arrived in Hallowbrook, he could breathe. He looked around, expecting to see the familiar fog rolling in, the town's strange, eerie stillness. But there was nothing. The town was gone. Instead, there was a vast, empty field stretching out before him, the horizon clear and open. The sun was rising in the distance, casting a golden light across the landscape. He wasn't in Hallowbrook anymore. Elliot stumbled forward, his legs weak from the tension of the past days. He had done it. He had broken the curse. But what did that mean? What had happened to the town? What had happened to the people who had been trapped there for so long? As he walked, the ground beneath him began to shift. The world around him wavered, as though reality itself was beginning to unravel. The sky darkened, and the wind picked up, whipping around him with increasing intensity. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the world went black. Elliot awoke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. He was lying on the ground, the familiar scent of dust and decay filling his nostrils. He sat up quickly, his breath coming in short gasps. He was back in Hallowbrook. But this time, something was different. The clock tower loomed in the distance, its hands frozen at 3 a.m. The cycle had begun again. Elliot blinked against the harsh sunlight that filtered through the fog, his senses confused and disoriented. He could still feel the weight of the clock tower's power pressing down on him, as if the very ground beneath him had shifted. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold stone of the old church he had passed earlier. His mind raced. This couldn't be happening. He had broken the cycle, and he had stopped the gears, stopped the clock. He had freed himself. But now, here he was again. The fog was back. The silence was back. The town was back. He stumbled to his feet, panic rising in his chest. His eyes darted to the clock tower. The hands were still frozen at 3 a.m. But there was something more unsettling about it now. The tower felt wrong. It felt as though it was watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. Why? Elliot whispered to himself. Why is it still here? Why can't I leave? He took a step forward, his legs trembling beneath him. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had the curse not been broken? Or had he simply done something that caused it to reset, like a glitch in the fabric of time? As he walked down the street, he noticed something else. The houses were different. They looked older, more decayed. Some of the windows were shattered, their frames warped and rotting. The town felt ancient, forgotten, but the strange thing was that it wasn't just the buildings that had changed. The air itself felt different. He could almost taste the decay, the stagnation. It was as though time itself had become warped, tangled in some kind of loop that refused to break. Elliot's stomach twisted. The town had reset, yes, but it wasn't the same. It was darker, more oppressive. The very essence of it had shifted, and now it felt like the town was alive in a way that it hadn't before. A sound broke through his thoughts, a faint whisper on the wind. He turned sharply, his heart racing. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. A voice calling his name. Elliot. He spun around, his eyes scanning the empty street. There was no one there. The fog swirled, but there were no figures, no shadows, no signs of life. The town was as silent as ever. But the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent. Elliot. His breath caught in his throat. It was coming from the direction of the clock tower. Without thinking, Elliot began to walk toward it. His legs moved on their own, as if some force was guiding him. The voice was like a thread pulling him forward, and no matter how much he tried to resist, he couldn't stop. As he reached the base of the tower, the door creaked open, as though it had been waiting for him. He stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The air inside the tower was thick, heavy with the smell of old wood and dust. The gears were still frozen, their motion halted at 3 a.m. But now there was something new. A figure stood at the top of the tower, silhouetted against the faint light that filtered through the cracks in the stone walls. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, and as Elliot's eyes focused on it, he felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. "Who are you?" Elliot demanded, his voice shaky but determined. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it simply raised a hand, pointing toward the gears. Elliot's breath hitched. He knew what he had to do. He had to turn the gears again. He had to finish what he had started. But as he approached the clock mechanism, the figure spoke. "You think you can stop it?" The voice echoed through the tower, low and mocking. "You think you can break the cycle? You cannot. You will never escape." Elliot's blood ran cold. The voice. It was the same as the one he had heard before, the one that had haunted him, the one that had claimed the souls of the town. It was the entity, the force that had bound Hallowbrook to its curse. "I've already broken it once," Elliot said, his voice trembling with both fear and anger. "I freed myself. I freed the town." The figure's shadowy form seemed to shudder, as though it were laughing at him. "You fool. You cannot break what is eternal. You cannot defeat me. You cannot escape Hallowbrook. Not now. Not ever." Elliot's fists clenched. "I won't stop trying." With a roar of defiance, he lunged toward the gears, his hands desperately gripping the rusted metal. The tower groaned in response, and the air seemed to crackle with a malevolent energy. The figure's voice rose, growing more distorted, more furious. "You are mine, Elliot. All of you. All of them. The cycle will continue, no matter what you do. I will always be here." Elliot gritted his teeth and pushed with all his strength. The gears began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, the sound of grinding metal filling the air. The clock hands began to move again, and the tower shuddered as if it were coming alive. The ground beneath him trembled, and the walls of the tower seemed to warp and twist, as though reality itself was being torn apart. And then, just as it had before, everything stopped. The tower fell silent. The gears ceased their movement. The clock's hands froze once more, this time at 6 a.m. Elliot collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. His mind was spinning, his body trembling with exhaustion. What had just happened? Had he broken the cycle again? Had he freed himself? Or was this just another false hope? Another fleeting moment of freedom before the town pulled him back into its grip? As he looked around, the fog began to dissipate, and the town seemed to shift once more. The buildings straightened, the streets cleared. The silence was broken by the faint sound of footsteps, human footsteps, approaching from the distance. Elliot looked up, his heart hammering in his chest. A figure was walking toward him, a woman with long, dark hair and pale skin. It was Martha. Her face was expressionless, but there was something in her eyes, a sadness, a resignation, that sent a chill down Elliot's spine. "You're still here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Martha stopped in front of him, her gaze steady. "You can't escape, Elliot. You can't break the cycle. It's already begun again. It always does." Elliot's blood ran cold. No, this can't be happening. I did everything I could. I stopped the clock. Martha knelt down beside him, her voice soft but firm. "You can't break the cycle because the cycle isn't just about time. It's about the souls of this town. The souls that were promised to the entity. The souls that were never meant to leave." Elliot's mind reeled. "What are you saying? That I'm trapped here forever?" Martha nodded slowly. "You were never meant to escape. None of us were." Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of Martha's words sank in. He had been fighting to escape the town, to break free from the curse. But now, it seemed as though there was no way out. No matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, the town would always pull him back. The cycle would always reset. But there was something in Martha's eyes, a flicker of something, a glimmer of hope, or perhaps a warning. "You're not the first to try," she said softly. "Others have come before you, and they too tried to break the cycle. But in the end, they all failed. They all became part of the town, just like me." Elliot felt a surge of frustration. "Then why haven't you given up? Why are you still here?" Martha's gaze softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Because, Elliot, there's one thing the entity doesn't understand. There's one thing it can't control." "What?" Elliot asked, his voice hoarse. Martha's lips curled into a faint, sad smile. "Choice." Elliot's mind buzzed with confusion and disbelief. The words Martha had spoken echoed in his head. Choice. Could it really be that simple? Could it be that the entity's power was not absolute? That there was a way to escape, a way to truly break the cycle? He looked at Martha, her face pale but resolute, as though she had seen this all before, as though she knew what was coming. "Choice," he repeated, his voice trembling. "What do you mean? How can we choose? The entity controls everything here. It controls time, it controls the people, the very essence of this place. How can we possibly choose to leave?" Martha stood up slowly, her expression distant, as if she were seeing something beyond him, beyond the town. "The entity believes it controls everything," she said softly. "But it's wrong. It doesn't understand the one thing it can't control. The human will. The will to fight, to resist, to make a choice. That's the one thing it can't predict." Elliot felt a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by doubt. "So, you're saying that if I just choose to leave, I can escape? That the cycle will stop?" Martha shook her head slowly. "It's not that simple. The choice is not just about leaving. It's about breaking the pact, about severing the bond between you and the town. The entity feeds on the souls it traps, but it also feeds on the despair, the hopelessness. It thrives on the belief that there's no way out. If you can make the choice, truly make it with your whole heart, then you can break the cycle. But it won't be easy." Elliot swallowed hard. He felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. The town had been a prison for so long, but now, it seemed like it could be more than that. It could be a battleground, a place where he could finally take control. He glanced at the clock tower. The hands were still frozen at 6 a.m. The town was eerily still, the fog hanging in the air like a veil. For a moment, he wondered if he had already failed. But then, he remembered the feeling he had when he first arrived. The sense of being trapped, of being bound by something unseen. It wasn't just the town, it was the curse itself, the entity that had woven its web around everything and everyone. Elliot looked back at Martha, his eyes hard with determination. "What do I have to do?" Martha stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have to confront the entity. You have to face it in the place where it was born. The clock tower. You have to make the choice to break the bond, to sever the tie between you and this place. If you can do that, you will free not only yourself, but everyone who has been trapped here. Elliot felt his heart race. And if I fail? Martha's eyes darkened, her expression grave. If you fail, you will become part of the town. You will be trapped here forever, just like the others. Just like me. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The stakes were higher than ever. He wasn't just fighting for his own freedom anymore. He was fighting for the souls of everyone who had been trapped in Hallowbrook. He was fighting for Martha, for the people who had been consumed by the town's curse. Then I won't fail, he said, his voice steady. I won't let it win. Martha gave him a faint, sad smile. Good. But remember, Elliot, the choice isn't just about escaping. It's about choosing what you're willing to sacrifice. The entity feeds on that too. It knows your deepest fears, your regrets. It will try to use them against you. Be ready. Elliot nodded, his resolve hardening. He had come this far. He had faced the horrors of the town, the whispers in the dark, the chilling voice of the entity. He had seen what it could do, how it could twist the world around him, how it could trap him in a never-ending cycle. But now, he had a chance to break free. He had a chance to end it all. I'm ready, he said, his voice unwavering. Martha stepped back, her form fading into the mist. Good luck, Elliot. You'll need it. With one last look at the clock tower, Elliot turned and began walking toward it. The air grew colder with every step, the fog thickening around him, but he pressed on. He had no choice now. He had to face the entity. He had to make the choice. The clock tower loomed before him, its shadow stretching long across the ground. The air around it seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, and the very earth beneath his feet seemed to tremble. The tower was no longer just a structure. It was a symbol of everything that had kept him trapped. It was the heart of the curse, the source of the town's power. And now, he was standing at its doorstep, ready to confront whatever waited inside. Elliot stepped through the door, which creaked open as if it had been waiting for him. The inside of the tower was just as he remembered, cold, decaying, and silent. The gears were still frozen, the clock hands unmoving. But there was something else now. A presence, something ancient and malevolent, seemed to fill the room. The voice came again, low and mocking, echoing off the walls. You think you can break the cycle, Elliot? You think you can defeat me? You are nothing, just a fleeting moment in time. I am eternal. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood tall, his fists clenched. I'm not afraid of you anymore, he said, his voice steady. I know what you are. I know what you've done. And I won't let you control me. The entity laughed, a sound that sent a chill down his spine. You think you can resist me? You are already mine. You always have been. The moment you set foot in this town, you became part of it. You cannot escape. Elliot shook his head. I don't belong here. I never did. The entity's voice grew more distorted, more furious. You are nothing without me. You will never escape. You will always be a part of Hallowbrook. Elliot took a deep breath. His mind focused on the one thing that could break the curse, his choice. He had to make it. He had to choose to sever the bond between himself and the town. He had to choose to break free. The gears in the tower began to turn again, slowly at first, then faster, as if the entity was trying to force him to give in. The clock hands began to move, but Elliot didn't flinch. He had made his choice. He wasn't going to let the entity win. With a roar of defiance, Elliot reached out and grabbed the central gear, turning it with all his strength. The tower groaned in protest, the walls shaking as the clock hands continued to move. But Elliot didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to finish this. And then, with a final, deafening crack, the gears stopped. The tower fell silent. For a moment, everything was still. The air was thick with tension, and Elliot's heart raced in his chest. Had he done it? Had he truly broken the cycle? The fog outside began to lift, the oppressive atmosphere slowly fading. The ground beneath Elliot's feet felt solid, as if the weight of the town's curse had finally been lifted. The air was clear, the sky brightening with the first light of dawn. And then a voice spoke. Well done, Elliot. Elliot turned, his breath catching in his throat. Standing before him was Martha, but she was no longer the same. Her face was peaceful, her eyes no longer filled with sorrow. She was free. You did it, she said softly, her voice full of gratitude. "You broke the cycle." Elliot looked around, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and disbelief. The town, once so oppressive, was now gone. The fog had cleared and the streets were empty, but there was no longer a sense of dread in the air. The curse had been broken. How? How is this possible? Elliot asked, his voice shaking with emotion. Martha smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. Because you chose. You chose to break the bond, to free yourself and everyone else trapped here. The entity can only control you if you let it. And you didn't. You chose to fight. You chose to be free. Elliot felt a weight lift from his shoulders, and for the first time he truly believed it. He had done it. He had broken the cycle. He had made the choice that would free him and everyone else from the town's curse. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, Elliot knew that he had finally escaped Hallowbrook. For good. Story 2. The road to Black Hollow Cove twisted like a serpent, clinging to the jagged cliffs that overlooked the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Elena Rhodes tightened her grip on the steering wheel as her car jolted over the uneven pavement, the tires occasionally slipping on patches of loose gravel. The coastal fog was so thick it seemed to swallow the world beyond her headlights, leaving her feeling as though she were driving through a void. She glanced at the GPS mounted on the dashboard. The signal had vanished an hour ago, leaving her with only a printed map and vague directions from the ferry operator. "It's a lonely place," the old man had said as he handed her the keys to the cottage. "Folks don't go there much anymore, but you'll find your peace, if that's what you're looking for." Peace. The word felt foreign to Elena, like a language she hadn't spoken in years. She had come to Black Hollow Cove to escape from the relentless pace of her life as a marine biologist, from the suffocating guilt that had haunted her since her sister's death, and from the ruins of her marriage. Here, in this remote corner of the world, she hoped to find solace in solitude and the rhythm of the tides. The headlights caught a weathered sign by the roadside. "Welcome to Black Hollow Cove. Population 132. The paint was peeling, and the wood was warped from years of salt air. Beyond it, the faint outline of a village emerged from the fog, its cluster of buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the biting wind. Elena drove past shuttered windows and empty streets, the town eerily silent except for the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Her destination lay beyond the village, at the edge of the cove. The research station was a small cottage that had been repurposed for visiting scientists. It was modest but functional, equipped with the tools she needed to study the unique tidal pools that dotted the coastline. Elena had read about the cove's rare marine life in a journal years ago and had jumped at the chance to study it firsthand when the opportunity arose. As she approached the cottage, the fog began to thin, revealing the dark silhouette of the lighthouse that loomed over the cove. Its presence was commanding, a stark sentinel against the gray sky. The tower's paint had long since faded, and the glass of the lantern room was cracked and clouded. Yet, even in its state of decay, the lighthouse seemed alive, its shadow stretching across the cliffs like a warning. Elena parked the car and stepped out, pulling her coat tight against the chill. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and seaweed, and the cries of gulls echoed faintly in the distance. She unloaded her bags and equipment, her gaze drifting back to the lighthouse. There was something unsettling about it, though she couldn't quite place why. Shaking off the feeling, she turned toward the cottage and unlocked the door. Inside, the cottage was cozy but sparse. A small kitchen and living area occupied the ground floor, with a narrow staircase leading to a loft bedroom. The furnishings were simple, the walls adorned with nautical charts and black and white photographs of the cove. A desk by the window held a stack of weathered field journals, presumably left by previous researchers. Elena set her bags down and took a deep breath, letting the stillness of the place settle over her. She spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking and setting up her equipment. Her work would focus on documenting the biodiversity of the tidal pools, analyzing water samples, and observing the behavior of the cove's unique species. It was the kind of meticulous, solitary work she excelled at, work that allowed her to lose herself in data and analysis, to forget everything else. By the time she finished, the sun had begun to set, casting the cove in hues of orange and gold. Elena stepped outside, her boots crunching on the gravel path. The fog had lifted enough for her to see the shoreline below, where waves lapped against the rocks. She could make out the dark shapes of the tidal pools, their surfaces shimmering in the fading light. Her gaze drifted back to the lighthouse. It stood silent and dark, its beacon long extinguished. Yet, as she stared at it, a strange sensation crept over her, a prickling at the back of her neck, as if she were being watched. She shook her head and turned away, telling herself it was nothing more than her imagination. That night, as she lay in bed, the wind howled around the cottage, rattling the windows and carrying with it the distant roar of the sea. Elena pulled the blankets tighter around herself, trying to ignore the unease that lingered at the edges of her mind. She closed her eyes and focused on the steady rhythm of the waves, letting it lull her to sleep. But her dreams were restless. She saw flashes of the lighthouse, its beacon piercing through the fog, illuminating the jagged rocks below. She heard whispers carried on the wind, voices she couldn't understand, but that filled her with a deep, inexplicable dread. And when she woke in the gray light of dawn, she found her pillow damp with seawater and the faint scent of salt lingering in the air. The morning light filtered weakly through the fog, casting the cottage in a dim, muted glow. Elena sat at the small kitchen table, nursing a mug of coffee and staring at her notebook. The previous night's dream clung to her mind like seaweed caught in the tide, vivid enough to leave her unsettled. The dampness on her pillow and the faint scent of salt water only deepened the unease. "It's just the ocean," she muttered to herself. "The air here is damp. Nothing strange about that." Shaking off the lingering dread, she grabbed her field bag and headed outside. The air was crisp, the kind that made her breath visible in faint puffs. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the rocky shoreline below. Waves crashed against the cliffs in rhythmic bursts, the sound both soothing and powerful. Her first stop was the tidal pools she had come to study. The pools were scattered across the jagged rocks, teeming with life. Brightly colored anemones, spiny sea urchins, and clusters of mussels clung to the surfaces, while tiny crabs scuttled among the crevices. Elena crouched beside one of the larger pools, carefully collecting water samples and jotting down notes in her journal. Despite the beauty of the ecosystem, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing on the cliffs above, but there was no one. Only the lighthouse loomed in the distance, its shadow stretching across the rocks like a dark omen. As the hours passed, Elena lost herself in her work. She cataloged the various species she encountered, took photographs, and recorded the salinity and temperature of the water. By midday, the sun had broken through the fog, casting the cove in a rare moment of warmth and light. She sat on a flat rock to eat her lunch, the lighthouse always in the corner of her vision. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elena returned to the cottage, her field bag heavy with samples. She set up her microscope and began analyzing the water, noting the high concentration of plankton and other microorganisms. The work was engrossing, and for a time, she forgot about the strange dreams and the lighthouse. It wasn't until she stepped outside to stretch her legs that the unease returned. The fog had rolled back in, thicker than before, and the air was eerily still. She stood on the path leading to the cliffs, listening to the distant crash of waves. The village below was shrouded in mist, its lights barely visible. The lighthouse towered above, its outline faint but unmistakable. And then she heard it, a low, mournful sound, like the groan of a ship's hull under strain. It rose and fell with the wind, carrying with it a faint whisper that made her skin crawl. She strained to hear, but the words were indistinct, as if spoken in a language she didn't understand. Elena. Her name. It was unmistakable, whispered on the breeze like a secret meant only for her. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound came again, softer this time, almost pleading. Elena. She turned toward the lighthouse, her eyes searching its dark silhouette. The whispers seemed to emanate from its direction, carried on the wind like an invitation. Her rational mind told her it was impossible. The lighthouse was abandoned, its beacon long extinguished. There was no one there, but the pull was undeniable. Inside the cottage, Elena paced the small living room, her thoughts racing. She tried to convince herself that the whispers were nothing more than the wind playing tricks on her. The isolation was getting to her, she reasoned. She had been alone for only a day, but the silence of the cove was oppressive, amplifying every sound and shadow. Still, the memory of her name whispered on the wind refused to fade. She found herself staring out the window, her eyes drawn to the lighthouse. It stood silent and dark, its presence both commanding and foreboding. "Get a grip," she muttered, rubbing her temples. "You're here to work, not chase ghosts." But sleep didn't come easily that night. She lay awake, listening to the wind howl around the cottage and the distant roar of the sea. Every creak of the wooden beams, every rustle of the wind, set her nerves on edge. And when she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, the dreams returned. She was standing on the cliffs, the lighthouse beacon blazing above her. The light swept across the cove, illuminating the jagged rocks below and the wreckage of a ship dashed against them. She could hear the cries of the doomed sailors, their voices blending with the wind in a haunting symphony. Elena. The whisper was louder this time, more insistent. She turned toward the lighthouse, its light blinding her, and saw a figure standing in the lantern room. It was indistinct, shrouded in shadow, but it raised a hand as if beckoning her closer. She woke with a start, her heart racing and her body drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the only sound the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. She sat up, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and looked toward the window. The lighthouse was dark, but for a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of light in the lantern room, like a single, fleeting pulse of the beacon. The next morning, Elena awoke to a pale, overcast sky and the relentless crash of waves against the cliffs. The dream lingered in her mind, vivid and unnerving, but she pushed it aside as she prepared for another day of work. She couldn't let her imagination distract her from the research she'd come all this way to conduct. Still, as she stepped outside, her eyes were drawn to the lighthouse. It stood silent and imposing, its weathered exterior blending into the gray backdrop of the sky. The memory of the flicker in the lantern room made her stomach churn, but she dismissed it as a trick of the light or her mind. The morning passed uneventfully. Elena returned to the tidal pools, meticulously cataloging the marine life and taking water samples. The cove was alive with activity. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries echoing off the cliffs, and the pools teemed with tiny creatures darting among the rocks. For a time, she lost herself in the work, her unease fading in the face of the natural beauty around her. But as the afternoon wore on, the sense of being watched returned. She couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on her, observing her every move. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, her gaze sweeping the cliffs and the village below. There was no one, just the lighthouse, its shadow stretching long and dark across the cove. By the time she returned to the cottage, the sky had darkened, heavy clouds gathering on the horizon. A storm was brewing, the air thick with the scent of rain and ozone. Elena hurried inside, locking the door behind her. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and whistling through the cracks in the walls. She busied herself with analyzing the day's samples, hoping the familiar routine would calm her nerves. But as the storm intensified, the cottage seemed to come alive with noise. The wind howled like a living thing, and the rain lashed against the windows in relentless sheets. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing louder with each passing minute. Then came a knock. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm. Elena froze, her pen hovering over her notebook. She strained to listen, her heart pounding in her chest. A second knock followed, louder this time, echoing through the small cottage. She rose slowly, her pulse racing. No one should be out here, not in this weather, and certainly not at this hour. She approached the door cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The knock came again, insistent and demanding. "Who's there?" she called, her voice unsteady. No answer. She hesitated, her mind racing with possibilities. It could be a local, someone seeking shelter from the storm. Or it could be... She shook her head, forcing herself to stay rational. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and pulled it open. The porch was empty. Rain poured in torrents, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She stepped outside, squinting into the storm, but there was no sign of anyone. The path leading to the cliffs was deserted, the village below obscured by sheets of rain. Only the lighthouse stood visible, its dark silhouette looming against the stormy sky. A chill ran down her spine. She retreated inside, locking the door and bolting it for good measure. She stood there for a moment, her back against the door, trying to steady her breathing. And then she saw it. Through the rain-streaked window, the lantern room of the lighthouse was glowing. A faint, flickering light pulsed within, cutting through the darkness like a heartbeat. She stared in disbelief, her mind racing. The lighthouse had been abandoned for decades. The lantern had long since fallen into disrepair, its mechanisms rusted and broken. There was no way it could be lit, unless someone was inside. Elena didn't remember deciding to go to the lighthouse. One moment, she was staring at the flickering light, and the next, she was pulling on her raincoat and boots, her flashlight clutched tightly in one hand. The storm battered her as she stepped outside, the wind nearly knocking her off her feet. She forced herself forward, her determination outweighing her fear. The path to the lighthouse was treacherous, the rocks slick with rain, and the wind threatening to push her over the edge. She slipped several times, her flashlight beam bobbing wildly in the darkness. By the time she reached the base of the tower, she was soaked to the bone and shivering. The door to the lighthouse was ajar, creaking on its hinges as the wind pushed against it. Elena hesitated, her heart hammering in her chest. She shone her flashlight into the darkness beyond, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling upward. The air inside was damp and musty, the walls streaked with water stains and patches of mold. "Elena." The whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. It echoed down the staircase, seeming to come from the lantern room above. Her grip on the flashlight tightened as she stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind her with a deafening bang. She jumped, her breath catching in her throat. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under her weight. The beam of her flashlight danced across the walls, revealing faded graffiti and peeling paint. The whisper came again, louder this time, and she quickened her pace, her fear giving way to a strange, compulsive need to reach the top. When she finally emerged into the lantern room, the light was gone. The room was empty, the glass of the windows cracked and streaked with rain. The lantern itself was a rusted hulk, its mechanisms long since corroded. But the air was thick with the scent of salt and something else, something metallic like blood. And then she saw it, scratched into the glass of the lantern room window. In jagged, uneven letters was a single word. "Help!" Elena stared at the word etched into the glass, her breath fogging the cold surface as she leaned closer. The letters were crude, jagged, as if carved in desperation. Her mind raced with questions. Who had written it? How long had it been there? And why did it feel like the word was meant for her? The storm outside raged on, the wind howling around the tower and rain pelting the windows. She turned her flashlight toward the floor, scanning for any signs of life. The lantern room was empty, its rusted mechanisms silent and still. Yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as though unseen eyes were following her every move. "Elena." The whisper sent a jolt of fear through her, louder now and unmistakably close. She spun around, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the shadows. The room was empty. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she backed toward the staircase, her flashlight trembling in her hand. And then she saw it. Another message, this one scrawled on the wall beside the staircase in what looked like charcoal or soot. "Find me." The words were smeared and uneven, as if written in haste. Elena's breath hitched, her mind teetering on the edge of panic. She didn't know whether to run or stay, to flee the lighthouse or search it for answers. But something, curiosity, or perhaps the compulsion that had driven her here in the first place, kept her rooted in place. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. "If someone's here, show yourself." Only the storm answered, the wind shrieking like a living thing. Elena descended the spiral staircase cautiously, her flashlight sweeping over the damp walls. The lower levels of the lighthouse were just as decrepit as the lantern room, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Her footsteps echoed in the confined space, each creak of the stairs sending a shiver down her spine. At the base of the tower, she found a heavy wooden door she hadn't noticed earlier. It was slightly ajar, revealing a narrow passage that led into the cliffs beneath the lighthouse. A faint, salty breeze wafted from the darkness, carrying with it the faint sound of dripping water. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to return to the safety of the cottage and leave the lighthouse behind. But the whispers, the messages, they felt like a plea for help, a call she couldn't ignore. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped into the passage. The air grew colder as she descended, the walls damp and slick with moisture. Her flashlight revealed a tunnel carved from the rock, its rough surface glistening with seawater. The sound of dripping water grew louder, mingling with the distant roar of the ocean. The passage twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the cliffs. She nearly missed it, a faint glimmer of light ahead, barely visible in the darkness. She quickened her pace, her boots splashing through shallow puddles. The light grew brighter as she approached, revealing a small chamber carved into the rock. In the center of the room stood a rusted metal table, its surface covered in nautical charts and yellowed papers. Elena's flashlight beam danced across the room, revealing more messages scrawled on the walls. "Save them. The tide is rising." "It's too late." Her heart thudded in her chest as she scanned the messages, each one more desperate than the last. The words seemed to pulse with urgency, as though they were alive. She stepped closer to the table, her flashlight illuminating the scattered papers. Most were brittle and water-stained, their ink smudged beyond recognition. But one stood out, a piece of parchment, newer than the others, its edges curling but intact. The words on the parchment sent a chill through her. The light must shine again. They are trapped. Elena's fingers trembled as she picked up the paper. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, as though written in haste or under duress. She turned it over, but the back was blank. Beneath the parchment, a faded photograph caught her eye. It showed a group of people standing in front of the lighthouse, smiling men and women in old-fashioned clothing. The date scrawled on the back read 1903. Her eyes widened as she recognized one of the figures. The man in the center of the group, tall and broad-shouldered, was the same figure she'd seen in her dream. His face was stern, his eyes piercing even in the faded photograph. A lighthouse keeper, perhaps? But how could she have dreamed of someone she'd never seen before? Elena. The whisper was closer now, reverberating through the chamber like a breath against her ear. She spun around, her flashlight sweeping the room, but there was no one there. Her heart pounded as the whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing until they filled the space with an almost deafening cacophony. Elena, save them. The light. The tide. Stop, she cried, clapping her hands over her ears. What do you want from me? The whispers ceased instantly, leaving the chamber in an oppressive silence. For a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then, faint and distant, came the sound of rushing water. Her flashlight beam flickered as she turned toward the passage she had come through. The sound grew louder, a steady roar that sent a jolt of panic through her. The tide was rising. Elena bolted for the tunnel, her flashlight bobbing wildly as she splashed through the ankle-deep water. The air grew colder with every step, the roar of the tide echoing around her like a living thing. She slipped on the slick rocks, catching herself against the wall as water surged around her feet. By the time she reached the base of the lighthouse, the passage was flooded to her knees. She scrambled up the spiral staircase, her breath coming in gasps. The storm outside was relentless, the wind howling through the cracks in the tower and rain pounding against the windows. When she reached the lantern room, she collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving. The light was still out, the lantern a rusted relic of its former self. But the whispers were back, softer now, as though urging her to act. "The light must shine again," she murmured, clutching the parchment she had found. Her gaze fell on the lantern, its corroded mechanisms barely visible in the dim light. How could she possibly repair it? And even if she could, what would it accomplish? "Elena." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a deep, resonant tone that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the lighthouse. She turned slowly, her flashlight beam falling on the window. The word help was still etched into the glass, but now, beneath it, new words had appeared, scrawled as though by an invisible hand. "The tide brings death." Her stomach twisted as the storm outside seemed to intensify, the waves crashing against the cliffs with a force that shook the tower. She didn't know what was happening, whether it was real or some figment of her imagination, but one thing was clear. The whispers weren't going to stop until she acted. Elena stepped toward the lantern, her fingers brushing against the cold, rusted metal. The mechanisms were ancient, but as she examined them, she realized they weren't beyond repair. If she could find the right tools and fuel, she might be able to get it working again. Her mind raced as she descended the staircase, searching for anything she could use. In the base of the lighthouse, she found an old storage room, its door hanging off its hinges. Inside, she discovered a dusty toolbox and a rusted canister labeled kerosene. She wasn't sure if the fuel was still viable, but it was her only option. With trembling hands, she carried the supplies back to the lantern room. The storm raged on as she worked, the whispers growing louder with each passing moment. She cleaned the lantern's glass, replaced its wick, and poured the kerosene into the reservoir. Finally, she struck a match, her hand shaking so badly that it took several tries. The flame caught, and the lantern roared to life. The light blazed through the storm, cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. The whispers ceased, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to envelop the entire cove. Elena stared out the window, her breath catching as the light illuminated the waves below. The ocean was churning, its surface alive with movement. Shapes emerged from the water, figures, their forms faint and ghostly, reaching toward the light as though drawn to its warmth. They were sailors, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes filled with a mixture of anguish and relief. Elena watched in stunned silence as the figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist. One by one, they disappeared, their cries of despair replaced by a sense of peace that seemed to settle over the lighthouse. The storm began to subside, the wind dying down and the rain easing to a gentle drizzle. The light continued to shine, steady and unwavering, as if it had been waiting for this moment for decades. Elena sank to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. The whispers were gone, the messages silent. For the first time since she had arrived, the lighthouse felt still, at peace. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Elena woke the next morning to an eerie calm. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a pale gray, the air heavy with the scent of salt and rain-soaked earth. The lighthouse stood silent and imposing, its lantern extinguished but still resonating with the strange energy of the previous night. Her body ached from the effort of repairing the lantern, but her mind was restless. She couldn't shake the image of the ghostly figures emerging from the waves, their faces etched with anguish. Who were they? And why had the light freed them? Determined to find answers, Elena returned to the storage room at the base of the lighthouse. The room was a jumble of rusted tools, moldy tarps, and forgotten relics. But as she sifted through the debris, her hand brushed against something solid, a leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age. She opened it carefully, the brittle pages crackling under her fingers. The book was a journal, its entries written in a neat, precise hand. The first page bore a name, James Mallory, keeper of Blackwater Lighthouse. Elena's pulse quickened as she flipped through the pages. The entries began in 1901, detailing the daily routines of maintaining the lighthouse, trimming the wick, polishing the lens, monitoring the weather. But as she read on, the tone shifted. The entries became darker, more frantic, as though Mallory had been documenting something beyond his control. June 12th, 1903, the light failed tonight. A storm rolled in suddenly, fierce and unrelenting. I tried to relight the lantern, but the mechanism jammed. By the time I got it working again, it was too late. I could see the wreckage on the rocks below, splintered wood and bodies washing ashore. I don't know how many perished, but their faces haunt me. June 15th, 1903, the whispers began last night. At first, I thought it was the wind, but now I am certain they are voices. They call to me, begging for help. I cannot sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. June 20th, 1903, I try to leave today. Packed my things and started down the path. But the storm returned, though the skies were clear when I set out. It's as if the lighthouse won't let me go. The voices are louder now. They say the same thing over and over. The light must shine. July 1st, 1903, I've done everything I can to keep the lantern burning, but it's not enough. They're still here, trapped in the cove. I see them in the waves, their hands reaching for the light. They blame me. I know they do. And perhaps they're right. July 10th, 1903, I've made a decision. If I cannot save them, I will join them. Perhaps in death, I can find the peace that eludes me in life. To whoever finds this journal, light the lantern. Do not let it fail again. They're counting on you. Elena closed the journal, her hands trembling. The final entry was dated the same day Mallory had vanished. The locals had always assumed he'd fled, abandoning his post after the tragedy. But now, she knew the truth. Mallory hadn't left. He'd given himself to the sea. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the waves crashed against the rocks below. The whispers had stopped, but the weight of their plea lingered in her mind. The light must shine. That evening, Elena stood on the cliffs overlooking the cove, Mallory's journal clutched tightly in her hands. The tide was out, exposing jagged rocks and pools of seawater. She could see the remnants of wreckage scattered among the stones, splintered beams and rusted metal, half buried in sand. She descended carefully, her boots crunching on the wet rocks. The air was thick with the scent of brine and decay, and the sound of the waves filled her ears. As she approached the largest piece of wreckage, she noticed something glinting in the fading light. It was a locket, its chain tangled in the splintered wood. She picked it up, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The locket opened easily, revealing a tiny photograph inside, a woman and a child, their faces smiling and full of life. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the locket must have belonged to one of the victims of the wreck. She tucked it into her pocket, a sense of unease settling over her. The whispers might have stopped, but the cove still felt heavy with their presence. Elena, her breath caught in her throat. The voice was faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the cove. The rocks were empty, the waves lapping gently against the shore. But she could feel it again, that sensation of being watched. Elena, the tide is rising. The word sent a jolt of fear through her. She glanced toward the horizon, where the sun was dipping below the waterline. The tide was indeed coming in, faster than she'd expected. She turned to head back up the cliffs, but froze as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, his clothes tattered and soaked, his face pale and hollow. His eyes met hers, and she recognized him instantly. It was James Mallory, the man from the photograph, the keeper who had vanished over a century ago. "Elena," he said again, his voice a low, mournful whisper, "you must keep the light burning." Before she could respond, the tide surged around her, the waves rising with unnatural speed. Mallory's figure dissolved into the water, his voice echoing one final plea. "Save them." Elena scrambled up the rocks, her heart pounding as the tide surged higher. The waves crashed against the cliffs, spraying her with icy water as she climbed. The sound of the ocean was deafening, but Mallory's final words echoed in her mind. Save them. When she reached the top, she collapsed onto the wet grass, gasping for breath. The lighthouse loomed behind her, its dark silhouette stark against the twilight sky. She glanced back toward the cove, but there was no sign of Mallory or the wreckage. The rising tide had swallowed it all. Inside the lighthouse, she lit the lantern again, the warm glow filling the room. She couldn't shake the feeling that the light was the key, that it was the only thing standing between her and whatever dark force lingered in the cove. But the journal had left her with more questions than answers. How could she truly save the spirits trapped there? Was keeping the light burning enough? The next morning, Elena returned to Mallory's journal, flipping through the pages in search of clues. Her eyes fell on a folded piece of paper tucked between two entries. She pulled it out carefully, unfolding it to reveal a map of the cove and the surrounding area. The map was detailed, with markings indicating the lighthouse, the cliffs, and the cove itself. But one spot caught her attention, a small X drawn on the edge of the map, just beyond the rocks where the tide surged. Beside it, Mallory had written a single word, anchor. Elena frowned, tracing the lines of the map with her finger. What could the anchor signify? Was it a literal anchor or something more symbolic? She decided there was only one way to find out. When the tide receded that afternoon, Elena returned to the cove, the map tucked into her jacket. The storm had left the rocks slick and treacherous, but she made her way carefully toward the spot marked with the X. The location was at the edge of a tidal pool, where the water shimmered with an unnatural glow. As she approached, she noticed something embedded in the rock, a rusted iron ring, its surface encrusted with barnacles. It looked like part of an old ship's anchor, though most of it was buried beneath the sand. Elena knelt beside it, brushing away the sand with her hands. As she worked, she uncovered a chain attached to the anchor, its links thick and corroded. The chain disappeared into the tidal pool, vanishing into the depths. Her heart raced as she realized what she had to do. The chain was a tether, perhaps to whatever was holding the spirits trapped in the cove. If she could free it, maybe she could free them too. But the water in the pool was deep, and the thought of diving into it filled her with dread. She glanced back toward the lighthouse, its distant form a reminder of the light's protection. Gathering her courage, she removed her jacket and boots, tying the flashlight to her wrist with a piece of rope. The water was freezing as she slipped into the pool, her breath catching in her throat. She followed the chain downward, her flashlight cutting through the murky depths. The pool was deeper than she'd expected, the chain leading her to a cavern carved into the rock. Inside, she found the source of the glow, a massive, barnacle-encrusted chest, its surface shimmering with an eerie light. The chain was wrapped around the chest, binding it tightly. Elena's fingers trembled as she reached for the chain, her lungs burning from the lack of air. She pulled with all her strength, the links groaning in protest as they shifted. The chest began to glow brighter, the light pulsating like a heartbeat. Just as she thought she couldn't hold her breath any longer, the chain snapped free, and the chest's glow exploded in a burst of light. Elena surfaced with a gasp, the tidal pool shimmering with the remnants of the chest's light. She climbed out, shivering and soaked, her mind reeling from what she'd seen. The chain was gone, and the pool was still, its surface reflecting the gray sky above. As she stood, the air around her grew warm, and a soft hum filled her ears. She turned toward the ocean and gasped. The ghostly figures were back, but this time they were different. Their faces were no longer twisted with anguish, and their forms glowed with a soft, golden light. They stood on the waves, their hands raised in silent gratitude. Among them, she saw James Mallory, his face calm and serene. He nodded to her, his lips moving as though to say, "Thank you." The figures began to fade, their light merging with the horizon as the tide rolled in. Elena watched until they were gone, the cove once again quiet and empty. That night, Elena sat in the lantern room, the journal open on her lap. She wrote her own entry beneath Mallory's final words, detailing everything she had experienced. The light burned steadily beside her, a beacon of hope for anyone who might need it. She didn't know what the future held, but she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The spirits were free, the whispers silenced. The lighthouse had done its duty, and so had she. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Elena stood at the window, watching the light sweep across the cove. For the first time, she felt like she truly belonged, not just to the lighthouse, but to its legacy. And in the quiet, she swore she could hear Mallory's voice, carried on the wind. The light must always shine. Epilogue: the days turned into weeks, and the stormy season gave way to calmer waters. Elena remained at Blackwater Lighthouse, tending to the lantern with care and dedication. She found solace in the routines that had once been Mallory's, polishing the glass, trimming the wick, and keeping the journal updated with her observations. The whispers never returned, but the lighthouse still felt alive, its presence a comforting constant. Elena no longer feared the isolation. Instead, she embraced it. The lighthouse wasn't just a job or a temporary refuge. It was her purpose. One evening, as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, a small fishing boat approached the cove. Its lone occupant was an older man, his weathered face lined with years of experience at sea. He docked at the base of the cliffs and climbed the path to the lighthouse, carrying a satchel over his shoulder. "You must be the new keeper," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Samuel. I've been sailing these waters for decades. Thought I'd check in on you, see how you're settling in." Elena smiled, inviting him inside. She brewed a pot of tea, and the two sat in the lantern room, the golden light casting long shadows across the walls. Samuel listened intently as Elena recounted her experiences, her voice steady as she described the storm, the whispers, and the spirits in the cove. When she finished, Samuel sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "There have always been stories about this place," he said. "Wrecks, hauntings, strange lights in the sky. Most folks around here think it's cursed." Elena shook her head. "It's not cursed," she said firmly. "It's a place of redemption. The light isn't just a warning. It's a guide for the living and the dead." Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes drifting to the lantern. "You got a good heart, Keeper. This place needs someone like you." As the night wore on, Samuel shared tales of the sea, his voice weaving a tapestry of adventure and loss. When he finally departed, he left Elena with a gift, a weathered compass, its needle still true. "For when you need to find your way," he said with a wink. The seasons changed, and Blackwater Lighthouse became a beacon not just for ships, but for the small community that lived along the coast. Fishermen left offerings of fresh catch at the base of the cliffs, and travelers occasionally stopped by, drawn by the lighthouse's mysterious allure. Elena welcomed them all, sharing the stories she had uncovered and ensuring the light continued to shine. But there were nights, rare and fleeting, when she felt a presence in the lantern room. It was never frightening, only a quiet assurance, as though Mallory and the others were still watching, still grateful. On those nights, she would light a candle in their memory and stand at the window, gazing out at the endless sea. Years later, when Elena's hair had turned silver and her hands bore the marks of a lifetime of work, she wrote her final entry in the journal. "To the next keeper, the light is more than a tool, it's a promise. Keep it burning, and you'll never be alone." She closed the journal, placed it on the desk, and climbed the spiral staircase one last time. The lantern's glow bathed her in warmth as she stood in its light, her heart full of gratitude and peace. The tide rose and fell, the waves whispering their eternal song. And as the lighthouse stood steadfast against the elements, its light unwavering, Elena's legacy became one with its own, a story of redemption, resilience, and the unyielding power of the light. Story 3. Clara Rivers wasn't sure what to feel when the lawyer handed her the box. The man, a stoic figure in a gray suit, offered her a thin smile and a clipped, "My condolences," before turning his attention back to the stack of papers on his desk. The box itself was small, about the size of a shoebox, and worn with age. It smelled faintly of mothballs and dust, a scent that brought back vague memories of visiting her great-aunt Eleanor's house as a child. "She left this for you," the lawyer said, "specifically requested it go to you upon her passing." Clara nodded, unsure what to say. She barely remembered Eleanor, a reclusive woman who had lived alone in a sprawling Victorian house on the edge of town. The few memories she had were hazy and tinged with unease. Eleanor's piercing blue eyes, the way she'd stare a little too long, and the musty smell of her home. Clara's parents had rarely visited, and when they did, they always left quickly, muttering about how Eleanor was a little odd. Now, Eleanor was gone, and Clara was left with this box. She carried it home, setting it carefully on her desk before peeling back the brittle tape that sealed it. Inside, she found a folded note, a small key, and an ornate hand mirror wrapped in yellowed tissue paper. The mirror was stunning. Its frame was made of dark, tarnished silver, intricately carved with twisting vines and tiny faces that seemed to peer out from the metal. The glass itself was pristine, almost unnaturally so, with a faint silvery shimmer that caught the light in strange ways. Clara unfolded the note, her brow furrowing as she read the spidery handwriting. "Clara, this mirror has been in our family for generations. It is both a gift and a burden. Treat it with care, and never forget, it watches." The words sent a chill down her spine. She set the note aside and examined the mirror again, turning it over in her hands. Despite its unsettling aura, there was something mesmerizing about it. She placed it on her dresser, propping it up against the wall. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching her. She told herself it was just her imagination, the product of a long day and Eleanor's cryptic warning. But as she drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of her reflection standing over her, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The next morning, Clara woke to find the mirror exactly where she'd left it. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom window, glinting off the glass and making the carvings on the frame seem almost alive. She shook off the lingering unease from her dream and went about her day, convincing herself that the mirror was just a mirror. But over the next few days, strange things began to happen. It started small. Clara would catch glimpses of her reflection moving out of sync. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light or her own imagination. But then it became more pronounced. She'd brush her hair, and her reflection's hand would lag behind. She'd smile, and her reflection's expression would falter, the corners of its mouth twitching before settling into a faint smirk. One evening, her best friend Mia came over to study. As they worked, Mia's eyes kept drifting to the mirror. "That thing is creepy," Mia said, shuddering. "Where did you get it?" Clara hesitated. "It was my great-aunt's. She left it to me." Mia leaned closer, squinting at the carvings on the frame. "It's beautiful, but it gives me the heebie-jeebies. Have you noticed anything weird about it?" Clara shrugged, not wanting to sound paranoid. "It's just an old mirror." Mia didn't look convinced. "Still, I'd keep an eye on it." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The mirror seemed to dominate the room, its presence oppressive. She draped a blanket over it, hoping to block it from view. But when she woke up the next morning, the blanket was on the floor, and the mirror's surface was fogged over, as if someone had been breathing on it. By the end of the week, Clara's nerves were frayed. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, even when she wasn't near the mirror. Her reflection's movements grew more erratic, its smirk more pronounced. She started avoiding the mirror altogether, using her phone's camera or the bathroom mirror to get ready in the morning. One night, as she sat at her desk trying to focus on homework, she heard a faint tapping sound. She froze, her pen hovering over the page. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until she realized it was coming from the mirror. Slowly, she turned to look. Her reflection was standing still, its eyes locked onto hers. Then, with deliberate slowness, it raised a hand and tapped on the glass from the inside. Clara screamed, stumbling back and knocking over a chair. The reflection's mouth twisted into a grin, its teeth sharp and gleaming. Without thinking, Clara grabbed a heavy book from her desk and hurled it at the mirror. The glass didn't shatter. Instead, the mirror let out a high-pitched, inhuman shriek, the sound reverberating through the room. Clara clapped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. When the noise finally stopped, the mirror was silent, its surface rippling like water. She ran out of the room, slamming the door behind her. For the first time, she wondered if Eleanor's warning had been more than the ramblings of an eccentric old woman. Clara spent the night on the couch, curled up under a blanket with every light in the house blazing. Sleep was impossible. Her mind raced with questions, her great-aunt Eleanor's cryptic note echoing in her thoughts. By morning, she resolved to learn more about the mirror. Whatever was happening, it was beyond her understanding, and she needed answers. She started by digging through Eleanor's belongings, which had been hastily packed into boxes after the funeral. Most of it was mundane. Old photographs, brittle letters, and trinkets from a life lived in solitude. But in one box, she found a faded journal bound in cracked leather. The initials EW were embossed on the cover. Clara flipped through the pages, her heart pounding as she read. July 12th, 1978, I have inherited the mirror from my mother just as she inherited it from hers. It is beautiful, yes, but it carries a darkness I cannot ignore. The faces on the frame seem to watch me, and the glass U2026 it shows more than it should. August 3rd, 1978, I saw it today. My reflection moved when I did not. It smiled when I was afraid. I fear the mirror is alive, or something within it is. September 19th, 1978, I tried to destroy it. I tried fire, hammers, even burying it deep in the woods. But it always returns, unharmed. It is bound to our family, and I am its keeper now. Clara's hands trembled as she turned the pages. The entries grew more erratic, the handwriting more frantic. Eleanor had spent decades living with the mirror, trying to understand it, trying to control it. At the end of the journal, one passage stood out. To whoever inherits this cursed thing, do not trust it. It will tempt you, deceive you, and if you are not careful, consume you. It thrives on fear and attention. Ignore it, and it grows weaker. But beware, once it takes an interest in you, it never truly lets go. Clara slammed the journal shut, her breath coming in short gasps. She felt a surge of anger. Why had Eleanor left her this burden? Why hadn't she destroyed it? But deep down, Clara already knew the answer. The mirror couldn't be destroyed, and now it was her responsibility. Later that day, Clara decided to visit the antique shop in town. If anyone knew about cursed objects, it would be the eccentric owner, Mr. Hargrove. The shop was dimly lit and crammed with oddities. Dusty books, cracked porcelain dolls, and tarnished jewelry. Mr. Hargrove, a wiry man with thick glasses, greeted her with a curious smile. "What brings you here, Miss Rivers?" he asked, his voice tinged with amusement. Clara hesitated. "I need help with something old. A mirror." His smile faltered. "A mirror, you say? Describe it." She did, detailing the ornate frame, the pristine glass, and the strange occurrences. As she spoke, Mr. Hargrove's expression grew grave. "Ah," he said finally, "you've inherited the Watcher's mirror." "The Watcher's mirror?" Clara repeated, her stomach twisting. "It's a rare artifact," he explained. "Very old, very dangerous. The legends say it was created as a prison for a powerful spirit, U-2014A spirit, that feeds on fear and thrives on manipulation. It can't leave the mirror, but it can influence those who look into it. Clara's heart sank. How do I get rid of it? You don't, Mr. Hargrove said bluntly. The mirror chooses its keeper. It's bound to your family, and now to you. But you can weaken it. Starve it of the attention it craves. Don't look into it. Don't acknowledge it. The less power you give it, the less it can harm you. Clara left the shop feeling more helpless than ever. She wanted to believe she could ignore the mirror, but the memory of her reflection tapping on the glass made her doubt it was that simple. That night, Clara avoided her bedroom. She slept on the couch again, the journal clutched to her chest like a talisman. But even in the living room, she couldn't escape the mirror's presence. She dreamed of it. In her dream, the mirror was everywhere. On the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. Her reflection stared back at her from every angle, its smirk growing wider, its eyes glowing faintly. You can't ignore me, it whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. I am you, and you are mine. Clara woke with a start, her heart racing. She glanced at the clock, 3:33 a.m. The house was silent, but she felt the weight of the mirror's gaze, even from 2 rooms away. When she finally worked up the courage to return to her bedroom, she found the mirror had changed. The carvings on the frame seemed more pronounced, the tiny faces twisted into expressions of malice. The glass shimmered faintly, as if alive. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, her fear mounting. She remembered Eleanor's words, "Ignore it, and it grows weaker." Taking a deep breath, she turned her back on the mirror and left the room. But as she walked away, she heard it, a soft, mocking laugh that sent shivers down her spine. The days that followed were a test of Clara's resolve. She avoided the mirror at all costs, keeping her bedroom door shut and spending as much time as possible in other parts of the house. But the mirror refused to be ignored. At first it was subtle. Shadows flickered in the corners of her vision. Whispers echoed in empty rooms. And she often felt the prickling sensation of being watched. She told herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew better. One evening, as she sat in the kitchen scrolling aimlessly through her phone, the lights flickered. The room plunged into darkness for a moment before the bulb buzzed back to life. In that brief flash, Clara saw a shadow dart across the hallway, a tall, humanoid figure with glowing eyes. Her heart leaped into her throat. Gripping the edge of the table, she forced herself to breathe. "It's just stress," she whispered. "It's nothing." But when she looked at her phone, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The screen, which had been displaying a news article, now showed her reflection. It was the same mocking grin, the same glowing eyes. She dropped the phone with a yelp, the screen shattering on the tile floor. Clara couldn't take it anymore. She called Mia the next morning, her voice trembling as she begged her friend to come over. When Mia arrived, Clara spilled everything, the strange movements in the mirror, the tapping, the whispers, the shadow. She even showed Mia the journal, flipping to the most unsettling entries. Mia listened, her face pale but determined. "Okay," she said when Clara finished. "This is insane, but I believe you." Clara felt a rush of relief. "What do I do?" Mia hesitated. "We need to figure out what it wants. Maybe it's trying to communicate. Or maybe..." She trailed off, her gaze drifting toward the hallway where the mirror waited. "Maybe what?" Clara pressed. "Maybe we need to confront it," Mia said, her voice firm. Clara shook her head vehemently. "No, the journal says not to give it attention. That's how it gets stronger." Mia frowned. "But ignoring it hasn't worked, has it? It's still messing with you." The two debated for hours, but neither could come up with a plan that felt safe. Eventually, Mia suggested staying the night to keep Clara company. Clara agreed, grateful for the support. That night, as they sat in the living room watching a movie, the lights flickered again. Both girls froze, their eyes darting toward the hallway. "Did you see that?" Mia whispered. Clara nodded, her pulse pounding. A faint tapping sound echoed through the house, growing louder and more insistent. It was coming from the mirror. Mia grabbed Clara's arm. "Let's go. Together." Clara hesitated but nodded. They crept down the hallway, the tapping growing louder with each step. When they reached the bedroom door, Mia pushed it open. The mirror was glowing faintly, its surface rippling like water. Clara's reflection stood perfectly still, staring at her with an expression of triumph. "Clara," Mia whispered, "what is it doing?" Before Clara could answer, the reflection raised its hand and pressed it against the glass. A crack spiderwebbed across the surface, and the room filled with a deafening hum. The crack in the mirror widened, and a strange, dark mist began to seep out, curling like smoke. Clara and Mia stumbled back, their eyes wide with terror. "Close the door," Clara shouted, her voice barely audible over the hum. Mia slammed the door shut, but the noise didn't stop. The mist seeped under the doorframe, filling the hallway with an icy chill. "What do we do?" Mia cried, her voice trembling. Clara's mind raced. She remembered Eleanor's journal, the warnings about the mirror feeding on fear. She clenched her fists, trying to steady her breathing. "We can't let it scare us. That's what it wants." "That's easier said than done." Mia snapped, but she took a deep breath, following Clara's lead. The mist began to coalesce, forming a shadowy figure with glowing eyes. It loomed over them, its presence suffocating. "You can't ignore me forever," it hissed, its voice echoing in their minds. "I'm a part of you now." Clara stepped forward, her knees shaking, but her resolve firm. "You're nothing but a parasite," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "You can't control me." The shadow faltered, its form flickering. "Keep going," Mia urged. "You feed on fear, but I'm not afraid of you," Clara continued, her voice growing stronger. "You're just a reflection. You're not real." The shadow let out an ear-piercing shriek, its form collapsing into a swirling vortex of mist. The mirror in the bedroom shattered, the sound like a thunderclap. Then everything went silent. When Clara and Mia finally dared to open the bedroom door, they found the mirror reduced to shards on the floor. The carvings on the frame were blackened and twisted, as if burned. "Is it over?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. The oppressive feeling in the house was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. They spent the rest of the night cleaning up the broken glass and packing away Eleanor's belongings. Clara decided to take the journal to the antique shop, hoping Mr. Hargrove might know what to do with it. As the sun rose, Clara felt a sense of cautious relief. The mirror was gone, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow's parting words were more than a threat. "I'm a part of you now." Days turned into weeks, and life began to return to normal, or as close to normal as Clara could hope for. She avoided talking about the mirror, even with Mia, who had become her confidant throughout the ordeal. The shattered remains of the frame had been buried in the woods, far from her home, and she'd burned Eleanor's journal, hoping to sever any lingering connection to the cursed object. But the feeling of unease never truly left her. It was in the quiet moments when the house was still that Clara felt it most. A faint prickling on the back of her neck, the sense of being watched. She told herself it was just paranoia, the aftermath of a traumatic experience. Yet every now and then, she'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye, a flicker of movement, a shadow that shouldn't be there. One night, as she lay in bed, Clara woke to a faint noise. It was a soft tapping, so faint she almost convinced herself it was the wind. But as she strained to listen, it grew louder, more deliberate. Her heart raced. She turned on the bedside lamp and scanned the room. Nothing seemed out of place. The tapping stopped, leaving her in an oppressive silence. Then, from the mirrorless dresser across the room, she saw it. Her reflection. It was faint, like a ghostly outline on the polished wood, but it was there, and it was smiling. Clara stared, frozen in place, as the reflection's grin widened. It raised a hand, pressing it against the surface of the dresser, and mouthed words she couldn't hear. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're gone. I destroyed you." The reflection's eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth moved again. This time, Clara heard it, soft, like a whisper carried on the wind. "You can't destroy me." She stumbled out of bed, her breath coming in short gasps. The reflection didn't move, its gaze fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. Clara fled the room, slamming the door behind her. She spent the rest of the night on the couch, clutching a blanket and jumping at every sound. The next morning, she called Mr. Hargrove. "I thought it was over," she said, her voice trembling. "The mirror's gone, but it's still here. I saw it." Mr. Hargrove sighed, his tone heavy with regret. "I warned you. The spirit doesn't reside in the mirror itself. The mirror is just a vessel. Once it attaches to someone, it's much harder to get rid of." Clara's stomach dropped. "What do I do?" "There are rituals," he said cautiously, "but they're dangerous. And even if they work, there's no guarantee it won't find its way back to you." "Then what's the point?" Clara snapped, frustration boiling over. "The point," he said, his voice firm, "is to weaken it, to buy yourself time. The longer you resist, the weaker it becomes. But you must be vigilant. It will try to manipulate you, to break you. You can't let it." Desperate for a solution, Clara agreed to meet Mr. Hargrove at his shop. He led her to a back room filled with strange objects, candles, crystals, and jars of herbs. In the center of the room was a circular table covered in an intricate pattern of runes. "This is a binding ritual," he explained. "It won't destroy the spirit, but it will trap it, at least temporarily. The catch is you'll need to confront it directly." Clara's throat tightened. "Confront it? How?" "You'll need to summon it," he said. "Draw it out and force it into a new vessel. Once it's contained, you must keep the vessel sealed and hidden. Forever." Clara hesitated, fear warring with determination. "What kind of vessel?" Mr. Hargrove handed her a small, blackened mirror. It was plain and unadorned, the glass cloudy and dull. "This will do. It's already been prepared to hold the spirit. But be warned, if you fail, it will grow stronger." Clara swallowed hard and nodded. That night, Clara set up the ritual in her living room, following Mr. Hargrove's instructions to the letter. Candles flickered around the circle of runes, their flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The blackened mirror lay in the center, its surface reflecting nothing. Clara sat cross-legged at the edge of the circle, her heart pounding. She held a sprig of sage in one hand and a piece of Eleanor's journal in the other, a fragment she kept, just in case. "Spirit bound to the Watcher's mirror," she intoned, her voice shaking. "I summon you to this circle. Show yourself." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the air grew heavy and the temperature plummeted. The candles flickered violently, their flames stretching toward the ceiling. A shadow began to form in the center of the circle, coalescing into the familiar figure with glowing eyes. "You dare summon me?" It hissed, its voice dripping with malice. Clara gritted her teeth, her fear threatening to overwhelm her. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I bind you to this vessel. You have no power over me." The spirit laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the room. "You think you can contain me? I am eternal. I am you." Clara closed her eyes, focusing on the words of the ritual. She repeated the incantation, her voice growing louder with each repetition. The spirit writhed, its form flickering as if caught in a storm. The blackened mirror began to glow, its surface rippling like water. The spirit let out a deafening shriek as it was pulled toward the glass, its form twisting and stretching. With one final cry, it vanished, and the room fell silent. Clara stared at the mirror, her hands shaking. Its surface was smooth and still, the spirit trapped within. She wrapped it in a cloth and placed it in a wooden box, sealing it with heavy chains. Mr. Hargrove's words echoed in her mind. Keep the vessel sealed and hidden. Forever. She drove deep into the woods that night, burying the box in a secluded spot and marking the location with a single stone. As she walked away, she felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The spirit was contained, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly gone. And as she climbed into bed that night, she noticed something in the corner of her room, a faint outline on the wall, like a shadow without a source. It was watching. The days after Clara buried the mirror were deceptively calm. She returned to her routines, throwing herself into work and spending time with Mia. For the first time in months, she felt almost normal. But the shadows didn't leave. At first, they were fleeting, a flicker in her peripheral vision, a dark shape that disappeared when she turned her head. Then they became bolder. One night, as she walked into the kitchen, she saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was suffocating. Clara closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "It's not real. It's just my imagination." When she opened her eyes, the figure was gone. Clara's sleep was restless, plagued by nightmares of the mirror and the glowing-eyed spirit. She dreamed of the woods where she'd buried the box, the earth cracking open as the spirit clawed its way out. One morning, she woke with a start, her heart racing. Her arms felt sore, as though she'd been gripping something tightly in her sleep. When she looked down, she saw faint, dark marks on her wrists, like bruises shaped into claw-like patterns. Panic surged through her. She scrubbed at her skin, but the marks wouldn't fade. Mia came over later that day, her expression one of concern. "You look awful," she said. Clara forced a laugh. "Thanks. That's exactly what I needed to hear." Mia frowned. "I mean it. Are you sleeping at all?" "Not much," Clara admitted. She hesitated, then showed Mia the marks on her wrists. I think it's still here. Somehow." Mia's eyes widened. "I thought you said you got rid of it." "I did. I buried the mirror. Sealed it just like Mr. Hargrove said. But..." Clara trailed off, her voice trembling. "It feels like it's still watching me." Clara and Mia returned to the antique shop, desperate for answers. Mr. Hargrove listened intently as Clara described the shadows, the bruises, and the oppressive feeling of being watched. "It's not unheard of," he said gravely. "Some spirits leave a mark on those they attach to. Even if they're contained, their influence can linger." Clara's stomach churned. "What do I do?" Mr. Hargrove hesitated. "There's a cleansing ritual. It's dangerous, and it requires confronting the spirit directly once more. If you fail, it could strengthen its hold on you." Clara's hands balled into fists. "I don't have a choice, do I?" "No," Mr. Hargrove said. "But this time, you won't face it alone." The ritual required a sacred space, so Mr. Hargrove led them to an old church that had been abandoned for decades. The air inside was heavy with dust and decay, but the remnants of stained glass cast colorful patterns on the floor. Mr. Hargrove set up the ritual, drawing a circle of salt and placing candles at its edges. In the center, he placed a small, polished mirror, a new vessel to draw the spirit into. "You'll need to step into the circle," he told Clara. "The spirit will manifest, and you must command it to leave you. It will try to frighten you, to break your resolve, but you must stand firm." Clara nodded, her stomach twisting with fear. Mia grabbed her hand. "You've got this," she said, her voice steady. Taking a deep breath, Clara stepped into the circle. As Mr. Hargrove began the incantation, the air grew thick and cold. The candles flickered, their flames stretching unnaturally high. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes. The spirit appeared suddenly, its form more solid than before. Its glowing eyes bored into Clara, and its voice was a low growl. "You can't escape me," it said. "I am your fear, your guilt, your pain. I am everything you hide from." Clara's knees trembled, but she stood her ground. "You're nothing but a parasite," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't control me." The spirit laughed, its form growing larger. "You think you're strong? You're weak. You called me here, and now you'll never be rid of me." Clara closed her eyes, focusing on the incantation Mr. Hargrove had taught her. She repeated the words, her voice growing louder with each repetition. The spirit writhed, its form flickering as the mirror in the center of the circle began to glow. "You can't contain me," it screamed. Clara opened her eyes, her fear replaced by determination. "Watch me." With a final shout, she completed the incantation. The spirit let out a deafening shriek as it was pulled into the mirror, its form twisting and stretching until it disappeared. The candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. When Clara opened her eyes, the church was silent. The mirror lay in the center of the circle, its surface smooth and still. "It's done," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice heavy with relief. Clara stepped out of the circle, her legs shaking. Mia rushed to her side, wrapping her in a tight hug. "Is it really over?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Hargrove nodded. "The spirit is bound. But remember, it's not destroyed. Keep the mirror hidden, and never let it be broken." Clara nodded, her resolve firm. She knew the spirit's power wasn't gone, but for the first time in months, she felt free. As they left the church, the first rays of dawn broke through the stained glass, casting the room in a warm, golden light. And for the first time, Clara allowed herself to hope. Clara decided to bury the mirror in a remote location, far from prying eyes. With Mr. Hargrove's guidance, she chose a desolate stretch of land deep in the mountains, where the soil was hard and the air was thin. Mia accompanied her, carrying a lantern as they trudged through the rocky terrain. They found a secluded spot beneath a gnarled tree, its twisted branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. "This should be far enough," Mr. Hargrove said, his breath visible in the chilly air. Clara nodded and began to dig. The ground was frozen and unyielding, but she worked tirelessly, her resolve unwavering. Finally, after what felt like hours, she placed the mirror, wrapped in layers of cloth and sealed inside a metal box, into the hole. As she covered it with dirt, she whispered a silent prayer, hoping it would stay buried forever. For weeks, Clara avoided mirrors entirely. She removed the few that remained in her home and covered reflective surfaces with fabric. The fear of seeing something lurking in her reflection was too great. But as time passed, the shadows began to fade. The oppressive feeling of being watched diminished, and Clara found herself sleeping through the night for the first time in months. Mia stayed close, her presence a constant source of comfort. They spent evenings watching movies, cooking together, and talking late into the night. Slowly, Clara began to feel like herself again. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Mia turned to her. "Do you think it's really over?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "I think so, but I'll never forget what happened, and I'll never let my guard down again." Months later, Clara received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the envelope bore no return address. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message scrawled in jagged letters. "You can't bury me forever." Clara's blood ran cold. She stared at the note, her mind racing. How could this be possible? The mirror was buried, the spirit contained. She showed the letter to Mia and Mr. Hargrove. Both were equally disturbed, but neither had an explanation. "It could be a cruel joke," Mia suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Or it could be a warning," Mr. Hargrove said grimly. That night, Clara's dreams were plagued by visions of the mirror. She saw it buried in the earth, its surface glowing faintly. The spirit's voice echoed in her mind, a sinister whisper that grew louder and louder until it was a deafening roar. When she woke, she found herself standing in her living room, her hands trembling. The front door was open, and the cold night air blew in. She didn't remember getting out of bed. Over the next few days, strange occurrences began to unfold. Objects moved on their own. The sound of faint whispers filled the house at night. And once, Clara saw a handprint on her bathroom mirror, a handprint too large to be her own. Desperate, she returned to Mr. Hargrove. "I thought it was over," she said, her voice shaking. "But it's back. I can feel it." Mr. Hargrove looked troubled. "The spirit is stronger than I realized. It may have left a piece of itself behind, something that ties it to you." "What do I do?" Clara asked, her voice rising in panic. "You may need to destroy the mirror," he said reluctantly, "but doing so could release the spirit entirely. It's a last resort. Clara wrestled with the decision for days. Destroying the mirror could free her from its influence, but it could also unleash the spirit's full power. Leaving it buried might contain it, but she would never truly be free. Finally, she made her choice. With Mia and Mr. Hargrove by her side, Clara returned to the burial site. She unearthed the mirror, its surface gleaming ominously in the moonlight. Mr. Hargrove handed her a hammer. "If you're sure about this, you must strike quickly. Once it's broken, we'll need to perform a banishment ritual immediately." Clara nodded, her hands trembling as she took the hammer. She raised it high, her heart pounding. The spirit's voice echoed in her mind. "You'll regret this." With a cry of determination, Clara brought the hammer down. The mirror shattered, its shards scattering across the ground. A deafening roar filled the air, and a blinding light erupted from the fragments. The spirit's form emerged, writhing and screaming as it was pulled into the circle of runes Mr. Hargrove had prepared. Clara and Mia joined hands, chanting the banishment incantation. The spirit's cries grew fainter, its form dissolving into wisps of shadow. Finally, the light faded, and the forest fell silent. Clara stood over the shattered remains of the mirror, her body trembling with exhaustion. She felt a strange sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "It's gone," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in months, she felt truly free. As they walked back to the car, Clara looked up at the night sky. The stars seemed brighter, the air crisper. She knew she would never forget the horrors she had faced, but she also knew she had reclaimed her life. And as she held Mia's hand, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of peace. Months passed, and Clara settled into a quieter life. The oppressive shadows were gone, and the whispers no longer haunted her nights. She had returned to work full-time, reconnecting with colleagues, and rebuilding the parts of her life that had been neglected during her ordeal. Mia became a constant presence, their bond deepening into something Clara hadn't dared to hope for. Together, they created a sense of normalcy, filling Clara's home with warmth and laughter. But the past was not entirely silent. One evening, Clara received a package on her doorstep. There was no return address, and the handwriting on the label was unfamiliar. Her stomach twisted with unease as she opened it. Inside was a small, black-framed photograph of a mirror, not the one she had shattered, but one eerily similar. Beneath it, a single line was scrawled in red ink. "Did you think it would be that easy?" Clara's breath caught. She clutched the photo, her mind racing. Was this a cruel prank, or had the spirit's influence somehow endured? Clara showed the photograph to Mia and Mr. Hargrove. Both were deeply concerned. "This could be a coincidence," Mia said, though her tone was uncertain. Mr. Hargrove shook his head. "There's no such thing as coincidence when it comes to spirits of this nature. Someone may still be connected to the entity you faced." "Connected how?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Sometimes, spirits leave behind fragments of their essence in objects or even people," Mr. Hargrove explained. "It's possible that someone who came into contact with the mirror is being influenced, or worse, is acting as a conduit." Clara's mind raced. Could the antique dealer who sold her the mirror be involved? Or someone else who had crossed her path during the ordeal? "We need to trace the mirror's origins," Mr. Hargrove said. "If there are others who have been affected, they could be in danger." Clara and Mia returned to the antique shop where Clara had first purchased the mirror. The shop was dimly lit, its shelves crowded with dusty relics and forgotten treasures. The dealer, a wiry man with sharp features, greeted them with a wary smile. "Back again? I thought you'd had enough of antiques." Clara held up the photograph. "Do you recognize this?" The dealer's smile faltered. He glanced at the photo, then at Clara. "Where did you get that?" "It was sent to me," Clara said, "and I need to know why." The dealer hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. Finally, he sighed and motioned for them to follow him into the back. He led them to a cluttered office where he pulled out a worn ledger. "The mirror you bought, it came from an estate sale. The owner was a collector of unusual artifacts, and that mirror was one of his prized possessions. Why didn't you tell me this before?" Clara demanded. The dealer shrugged. "I didn't think it mattered. People buy creepy old things all the time. How was I supposed to know it was cursed?" "Do you have the name of the estate?" Mr. Hargrove asked. The dealer flipped through the ledger and pointed to an entry. "Here, the estate belonged to a man named Victor Armand." Clara, Mia, and Mr. Hargrove traveled to the Armand estate, a crumbling mansion on the outskirts of a small town. The property was overgrown with weeds, and the windows were dark and lifeless. "This place gives me the creeps," Mia said, shivering. Mr. Hargrove nodded. It's no wonder the mirror carried such a strong presence. Places like this tend to amplify spiritual energy. They entered the mansion cautiously, the air inside heavy with the scent of decay. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women, their eyes seeming to follow the intruders. In the study, they found Victor Armand's journals. The entries detailed his obsession with the occult and his experiments with summoning spirits. One entry in particular caught Clara's attention. "The mirror is the key. It is a gateway, a vessel for the Watcher. I must keep it hidden, for its power grows with each passing day." Clara's hands trembled as she read the words. The Watcher. That's what the spirit called itself. Mr. Hargrove frowned. It's more than a spirit. It's a malevolent entity, and it seems Victor Armand was trying to contain it. But something must have gone wrong. As they explored the mansion, they discovered a hidden room in the basement. Inside was a large, ornate mirror covered with a black cloth. The air around it was frigid, and the floor was marked with strange symbols. "This must be the original mirror," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice tense. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "What do we do with it?" "We destroy it," Mr. Hargrove said. "And this time, we ensure the entity has no place to escape to." But as they prepared to perform the ritual, the mirror began to hum, its surface rippling like water. A shadowy figure appeared within, its glowing eyes locking onto Clara. "You cannot stop me," the Watcher said, its voice a deep, menacing growl. The room shook violently, and the symbols on the floor began to glow. "We have to act now," Mr. Hargrove shouted. The room vibrated with an unholy energy as the Watcher's form grew clearer in the mirror. Its shadowy figure seemed to pulse, and its glowing eyes locked onto Clara with a malevolent hunger. Clara stepped back, her heart pounding. "What do we do?" Mr. Hargrove threw a pouch of salt around the mirror, creating a protective circle. "We hold it here. Clara, Mia, start the incantation." Clara fumbled with the book of banishment rituals Mr. Hargrove had given her. She flipped to the marked page, her fingers trembling, and began to chant. Mia joined her, their voices unsteady but growing stronger with each word. The Watcher let out a guttural laugh that echoed through the room. "Fools! You cannot bind me." The mirror's surface rippled violently, and dark tendrils began to emerge, slithering toward Clara and Mia. "Stay in the circle," Mr. Hargrove shouted, throwing another handful of salt at the tendrils. They recoiled with a hiss, but the Watcher only grew angrier. The symbols on the floor glowed brighter, their light intensifying with each word of the incantation. Clara felt a strange pull, as if the mirror were trying to draw her in. "Don't stop chanting," Mr. Hargrove yelled, his voice barely audible over the roaring wind that had erupted in the room. Clara focused on the words, her voice rising above the chaos. The tendrils lashed out again, one of them striking the edge of the salt circle and scattering the barrier. "No!" Mia screamed, grabbing Clara's arm. The Watcher seized the opportunity, its shadowy form spilling out of the mirror. It loomed over them, its presence suffocating. "You belong to me now," it hissed, reaching for Clara. Mr. Hargrove acted quickly, pulling a vial of holy water from his bag and hurling it at the watcher. The liquid sizzled on contact, and the creature let out a deafening screech. "Clara, the mirror is its anchor. You have to destroy it," he shouted. Clara hesitated, the memory of the first mirror's destruction flashing in her mind. She had seen the Watcher's wrath before. What if breaking this mirror unleashed something even worse? Mia grabbed her shoulders. "You can do this. We'll finish the ritual. Just destroy it." Clara nodded, her fear giving way to determination. She picked up a heavy iron candlestick from the floor and raised it high. The Watcher lunged toward her, its shadowy form stretching across the room. With a cry, Clara brought the candlestick down with all her strength. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, the shards scattering across the floor. A blinding light erupted from the broken mirror, and the Watcher let out a howl of rage. Its form began to disintegrate, its shadowy tendrils flailing wildly as it was pulled back into the void. "Finish the incantation," Mr. Hargrove yelled. Clara and Mia chanted the final words, their voices ringing out above the chaos. The light grew brighter, and the symbols on the floor flared one last time before fading into darkness. The room fell silent. Clara collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving. The air was still, and the oppressive presence of the Watcher was gone. "Is it over?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Mr. Hargrove nodded, his expression weary but relieved. "Yes, the Watcher is gone, for good this time." In the weeks that followed, Clara worked to rebuild her life once more. The Armand estate was sealed off, its dark history left to decay with time. Clara and Mia grew closer, their bond forged in the fires of their shared ordeal. They found solace in each other, and Clara began to see a future filled with hope rather than fear. Mr. Hargrove returned to his quiet life, though he stayed in touch, offering guidance and support whenever Clara needed it. One evening, as Clara and Mia sat on the porch of Clara's home, watching the sunset, Mia turned to her. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. Clara smiled, her hand resting on Mia's. "I do, and even if it's not, I know we can face whatever comes next together." Epilogue. Far away, in a dusty corner of an old curiosity shop, a small shard of glass from the shattered mirror sat unnoticed on a shelf. Its surface gleamed faintly, and for a moment, a pair of glowing eyes flickered within. The Watcher was patient. It would wait. Story 4. Elliot stood at the entrance of the Alastair Hotel, staring up at the faded sign that hung crookedly above the door. The hotel was grand in its own way, with its old stone facade and towering columns, but there was something unsettling about it. The windows were dark, and the air smelled of mildew and dust, like it hadn't been properly aired in years. He'd been traveling for hours, delayed flights, missed connections, and a long drive through a city he didn't recognize. All he wanted was a warm bed and a quiet place to rest for the night. The Alastair was the first hotel he'd found with an open room, and after a quick glance at the lobby, he didn't care much about the place's charm. It was late, and he was exhausted. The receptionist, a pale woman with dark circles under her eyes, greeted him with a forced smile as he approached the desk. "Welcome to the Alastair. How can I help you?" "I have a reservation." "Elliot Carter," he said, pulling out his ID. "I was hoping to check in." The woman nodded, her fingers tapping on the keyboard. The soft click of the keys was the only sound in the otherwise silent lobby. She handed him a small brass key. "Room 207. It's on the second floor. Enjoy your stay." "Thank you," Elliot replied, taking the key and glancing around the lobby. It was dark, almost too dark for such a large space. The chandeliers above flickered faintly, and the polished marble floors were scuffed and worn. He made his way to the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The second floor was eerily quiet, and the hallway stretched longer than it should have. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the doors to the rooms were old and weathered. as if they hadn't been opened in years. Room 207 was at the very end of the hall. He reached for the door handle, feeling a strange chill in the air. The moment he stepped inside, he knew something was off. The room was large, with an old wooden bed, a small desk, and a wardrobe in the corner. The curtains were drawn, and when he pulled them back to reveal the window, he froze. There was nothing outside, no city lights, no street below, just an infinite black void. Elliot stood frozen in front of the window, staring out at the void. His breath caught in his throat. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and peered back outside, but there was nothing there, no city, no streetlights, no signs of life. Just an endless expanse of darkness. He turned away from the window, his pulse quickening. This had to be a mistake, a strange optical illusion, maybe. The room's window must be broken, and the night sky had somehow become a deep, impenetrable black. But as he glanced around the room, something else caught his attention: the furniture. The bed was positioned directly under the window, but it was oddly placed. The desk, which should have been against the wall, was pushed toward the center of the room, and the wardrobe was slightly open, revealing only empty shelves. The room felt wrong. The furniture didn't belong. It was as though it had been haphazardly arranged by someone who didn't care about functionality, someone who had no regard for the space's purpose. Elliot tried to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. He was tired, exhausted in fact. He had been traveling for hours, and his body demanded rest. He decided to unpack, thinking that perhaps once he settled in, the strangeness would fade. He dropped his bag onto the bed and began to unpack his things, but his mind kept drifting back to the window. The void outside haunted him, gnawing at his thoughts. He couldn't help but feel as though the darkness beyond the glass was waiting for him to look again, waiting for him to acknowledge it. He turned back to the window, half expecting it to have changed, but it hadn't. The same oppressive blackness stretched on forever. He shook his head, frustrated with himself. He needed sleep. It was just a window, just an odd view. There was no reason to dwell on it. But then, as he turned away from the window, he felt something strange. A sudden shift in the air. The temperature in the room had dropped, just slightly, enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He glanced around, but the room seemed unchanged. Still, something was wrong. A sense of disorientation tugged at him, like the space around him had subtly shifted. He walked toward the door, planning to take a walk through the hotel to clear his mind, but as his hand touched the doorknob, he froze. The hallway. It didn't look the same as when he had entered. He could have sworn he had walked down a much longer hallway to reach room 207. The walls had seemed farther apart, but now, the hallway in front of him was narrow and short, stretching only a few feet before ending in another door. The light from the hallway flickered faintly, casting strange shadows along the walls. It looked almost wrong. He pulled the door open and stepped into the hallway. The hallway was silent. The air felt heavier, colder, and the flickering lights cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. Elliot took a few cautious steps forward, his shoes clicking against the worn wooden floor. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had he imagined the longer hallway? Had his mind been playing tricks on him? He glanced back at room 207. The door was still open, but now it seemed farther away than it had been when he left it. It was as though the hallway had stretched while he wasn't looking. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. No, I'm just tired. The journey had been long, and the exhaustion was beginning to set in. But when he turned to walk down the hallway again, his heart skipped a beat. He was back in front of room 207. The same door, the same number. It looked exactly as it had when he first entered, the brass handle gleaming faintly in the dim light. His breath hitched. How could that be? He had just walked down the hall, past several rooms, and yet now he was back in front of his own. A creeping sense of dread began to crawl up his spine. He stepped back, his pulse quickening. There was no way this could be happening. The hallway hadn't been this short before. He was sure of it. Elliot's fingers trembled as he reached for the doorknob again. He turned it slowly, half expecting to find the room unchanged, to find everything as it had been when he first entered. But when the door creaked open, The room inside was exactly as it had been before. The bed, the desk, the wardrobe, nothing was out of place. He stepped back into the room, his mind spinning. Was this some kind of mistake? A glitch? Maybe the hotel was older than he thought, with some sort of malfunctioning architecture or hidden passageways. But then the whispers began. Faint at first, barely audible, they seemed to come from the walls, the air itself. Soft murmurs, like voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. The sound was unsettling, like a distant conversation happening just beyond his reach. He spun around, heart pounding in his chest, but saw nothing. No one was there. The room was empty, save for the furniture. The whispers persisted, and with them, an overwhelming feeling of being watched. He walked to the bed, sat down, and tried to steady his breathing. The whispers continued, growing louder, more distinct, until one word echoed clearly in his mind. Elliot. He froze. His name. It was unmistakable. He stood up abruptly, looking around the room in panic. There was no one here. No one had spoken. But the whispers, they were coming from inside the room. He could feel them now, not just in his ears, but in his very skin, like a presence that filled the space. A sudden chill swept through the room, and the air grew thick. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and twist, as though they were alive. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room was suffocating him. Then the mirror caught his attention. The reflection wasn't his. It was close, but not quite right. His face was there, but the expression his reflection was smiling. Not the neutral, tired look he had been wearing. No, this was a wide, unsettling grin, a smile that didn't belong to him. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest. He took a step back, his breath shallow, his legs unsteady. His reflection continued to smile, the eyes glinting with a strange, knowing gleam. And then the reflection winked. By now, Elliot was certain that something was terribly wrong. The room, the hotel, the hallway, everything was beginning to feel like it was twisting around him. He needed answers. He needed to know what was happening. He stepped back from the mirror, his legs shaking, and turned toward the door. He needed to get out of this room. Maybe if he found someone who could explain all of this, he could get some semblance of control back. As he stepped into the hallway, once more, he saw him. The man was standing near the end of the hall, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes dark and sunken. He was dressed in a shabby suit, his hands clasped behind his back. There was something unsettling about him, something that made Elliot's skin crawl. The man didn't move as Elliot approached, but when their eyes met, the man spoke in a low, raspy voice. "You're not the first." Elliot stopped in his tracks, confused and afraid. "What do you mean?" The man's eyes darkened. "You found room 207, haven't you? You've seen it for what it really is." The man's presence in the hallway was unnerving. His appearance was disheveled, as though he had been trapped in the hotel for years, perhaps decades. His suit was old, the fabric frayed at the edges, and his shoes were scuffed beyond recognition. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to bore into Elliot's soul as he spoke. "You're not the first," the man repeated, his voice raspy, as though he hadn't spoken in years. "And you won't be the last." Elliot took a cautious step back, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The man's lips curled into a faint, sad smile. "I was like you once, a traveler, a stranger, looking for a place to rest. But I found something else instead. Something I wish I had." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. "What are you talking about? What's happening here?" The man glanced down the hallway, as if making sure no one else was listening, before leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Room 207. It's not just a room. It's a doorway to places that shouldn't exist, to spaces where time doesn't follow its rules. The hotel, it's alive. It feeds on the lost, on those who wander in and never leave. And once you're here, once you've found the room, it doesn't let go." Elliot's mind raced. He couldn't make sense of what the man was saying. A doorway? A hotel that was alive? It sounded insane, like something out of a bad dream. But then the whispers returned, louder this time, filling his ears, echoing in his skull. "Elliot, Elliot. He recoiled, his eyes wide with panic. What is that? What's happening to me? The man's expression darkened, his eyes filled with pity. It's the room. It's calling you. It wants you. The more you resist, the more it will twist you, bend you, until you're no longer sure what's real. You'll see things that aren't there. You'll hear things, and in the end, you'll become part of it. A part of the hotel's endless hunger. Elliot shook his head, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. He had to get out. He had to leave. Is there a way out? Elliot asked, his voice trembling. The man's gaze softened, but there was no hope in his eyes. There is no escape. Not once you've found the room. The only way to leave is to give in, to surrender yourself to the hotel, to become one of its lost souls. Elliot's heart sank. I don't believe you. There has to be a way out. The man took a step closer, his voice low and urgent. You can fight it, but it will never stop. It will never let you go. You'll be trapped here forever, just like me, just like the others. Elliot looked around, his thoughts spinning. The hallway stretched out before him, endless and silent. There was no escape. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the temperature dropped again, as if the hotel itself was drawing him in. Suddenly, the man's expression shifted. His face twisted into something darker, more sinister. The smile faded, replaced by an unsettling grimace. You'll see. You'll understand. It's already too late. Elliot took a step back, his mind reeling. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let the hotel consume him like it had consumed this man. He turned and bolted down the hallway, desperate to escape. But no matter how fast he ran, the hallway seemed to stretch further and further. The door to room 207 was always in front of him, as if the hotel itself was playing a cruel game. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows stretching like dark tendrils, reaching for him. He stopped, panting, his hands shaking. The whispers were louder now, echoing from every direction. He turned around, but the man was gone. The hallway was empty. He was alone with the hotel. Elliot's mind was spinning. He had to get out. He had to leave before the hotel claimed him like it had claimed the man. But every step he took seemed to lead him in circles, back to the same place. The same hallway, the same door. He tried to open the door to room 207 again, but it wouldn't budge. The knob twisted in his hand, but the door remained shut, as if it were locked from the inside. Panic set in. He banged his fists against the door, shouting for help, but no one answered. The silence of the hotel pressed in on him, suffocating him. He could feel the weight of the room, the hotel bearing down on him. And then he heard it, a sound, faint at first but growing louder. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. It was as though the hotel was speaking to him, beckoning him closer. Elliot. The voice was unmistakable. His name, whispered in the darkness. He turned around, his heart racing. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was as though something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to make the wrong move. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, breathing in time with his own frantic heartbeat. Elliot felt the presence closing in on him, a weight pressing against his chest. He turned back to the door, desperate to escape, but before he could reach it, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps echoing through the hallway. Elliot spun around, his breath caught in his throat. A figure appeared at the far end of the hallway, standing in the shadows. It was tall, its features obscured by the darkness, but Elliot could feel its gaze on him, cold and unblinking. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply watched. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, all calling his name. Elliot. He could feel the figure's presence pressing in on him, surrounding him. He could feel its eyes on him, even though he couldn't see its face. And then the figure took a step forward. Elliot's heart raced as he backed away, his legs trembling. He tried to run, but his feet felt like they were stuck in place. The hotel seemed to hold him in its grip, trapping him in the hallway with the figure. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Elliot's breath came in short gasps. He couldn't move. He couldn't escape. The figure was almost upon him now, its presence suffocating. And then, just as it reached out for him, the door to room 207 opened. Elliot stumbled backward, his mind in a haze. The door to room 207 had opened by itself, and a cold gust of air rushed out from within, carrying with it the faintest scent of something rotten. He hesitated for a moment. Then, driven by some primal instinct, he ran toward the door. The figure in the hallway was now just a shadow in his peripheral vision, but he couldn't afford to look back. He had to get inside the room. He had to escape whatever was waiting for him out there. He slammed the door shut behind him, locking it with trembling hands. For a moment, he stood in the silence, gasping for breath, his chest heaving. The room was still as it had been when he first entered. Bed, desk, wardrobe, nothing had changed. But the air was different now, heavier, colder. Elliot glanced around the room, his eyes darting from one corner to the next. There was something wrong with it, something he hadn't noticed before. And then his gaze fell on the mirror. It was reflecting him, but not in the way he expected. His reflection was distorted, twisted. His own face was smiling at him, grinning, in fact, a wide, grotesque grin that didn't belong to him. His reflection's eyes glinted with a strange, knowing light. Elliot's heart stopped. The reflection didn't move like he did. It lingered, watching him with that unnerving smile. It wasn't just a mirror, it was a window into something else, something darker. And as the reflection winked at him, Elliot realized the horrible truth. He wasn't alone. The room had him now. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the mirror. His reflection, no, not his reflection, grinned back at him, its eyes glinting with an unsettling knowingness. His own body stood frozen, but the figure in the mirror moved, its grin widening as if it had become aware of his fear. His heart hammered in his chest as he took a step backward, away from the mirror. His feet felt heavy, as though the floor was pulling him down, urging him to stay. He tried to look away, but the reflection held him captive, its gaze unblinking. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in, tightening around him like a vice. Elliot stumbled backward, unable to tear his eyes away from the reflection. The mirror seemed to distort further, warping and rippling like water. His own face was still smiling, but now it was no longer his, it was someone else's. It was a stranger's face, a man he didn't recognize, but the smile remained. The smile that was too wide, too sharp. And then the reflection spoke. "You're not supposed to be here," it whispered, the voice low and guttural, echoing in the room like a distant chant. The words seemed to seep into his skin, reverberating in his bones. Elliot's stomach churned. "What? What are you?" The figure in the mirror tilted its head, its eyes narrowing. "We are the same," it said, its voice growing colder, more insistent. "You are me, and I am you. We are all part of the room now." The words sent a wave of nausea crashing over him. He turned away from the mirror, stumbling toward the door, but the room seemed to stretch farther than he remembered. The door was no longer in the same place. It had vanished, swallowed by the shifting walls. He could feel the space around him warping, twisting, as if the hotel itself were alive, moving, reshaping. The whispers grew louder, filling his ears, crawling under his skin. "Elliot! Elliot!" He spun around, his breath ragged, and saw the reflection again. It was no longer just a reflection, it was moving. The figure in the mirror reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, and Elliot felt a sudden, cold sensation against his own chest, as though the mirror was reaching through to him. He screamed, but the sound was muffled, as if the room itself was swallowing his voice. "You're mine now," the reflection whispered, its lips curling into that grotesque, too wide smile. "You belong to the hotel." Elliot's body froze. The room felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on him. He was trapped in this place, in this room, with no way out. His mind raced, desperately searching for an escape, but there was nothing, Nothing but the reflection, the walls, and the whispers. And then the door appeared. It was no longer the same door he had seen earlier. It was different now, darker, with strange markings etched into the wood, symbols that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The handle gleamed faintly, as if beckoning him forward. Elliot hesitated, his hand hovering above the door. Should he try to escape again? Could he? Before he could make up his mind, the door creaked open on its own. Elliot's heart pounded as he stepped toward the door. The room behind him seemed to darken, the shadows stretching and twisting like living things. The whispers were louder now, deafening, but he couldn't understand them, just his name, over and over, like a chant. Elliot. He gritted his teeth and pushed the door open, stepping into the unknown. The hallway beyond the door was different. It was familiar, yet unfamiliar. The walls were lined with old, peeling wallpaper, the floor creaking under his feet as he walked. The air was thick, heavy, as though the very atmosphere was soaked with the weight of something ancient. The hallway stretched out before him, dimly lit by flickering lamps that cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. Elliot's pulse quickened as he looked around. There were no windows, no signs of life. The hallway felt abandoned, forgotten, but it was also alive. He could feel it in the air, a pulse, a hum that resonated through his bones. As he moved down the hallway, he saw doors, rows of doors, stretching endlessly into the darkness. Each one was slightly different, but all of them had the same eerie quality. Old, weathered, with strange symbols carved into the wood. Some doors were cracked open, revealing only darkness beyond, while others were shut tight, their handles cold and unyielding. He passed one door and froze. Something about it felt different. There was a faint light seeping from the crack beneath the door, a soft, flickering glow. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the handle. It was cold, colder than it should have been. He turned the handle, and the door creaked open. Inside, the room was bathed in a strange, greenish light. The walls were covered in what appeared to be old photographs, yellowed with age. The photos were of people, faces he didn't recognize, but there was something about them that made his skin crawl. Their eyes seemed to follow him as he moved, watching him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. At the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror. It was framed in gold, its surface cracked and weathered, but still reflecting the room with a faint, eerie glow. And then Elliot saw it. The reflection was not his own. It was the man, the one from the hallway, the one who had warned him. The man was standing in the mirror, staring at him with hollow eyes. His lips moved, but no sound came from his mouth. The man's reflection was distorted, his features blurred and shifting, as though he were not quite real. Elliot took a step back, his heart racing. "What is this place?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The man in the mirror smiled, his expression twisted and unnatural. And then, in a voice that echoed in Elliot's mind, he spoke. "This is the other side, the place where the hotel keeps its secrets, the place where the lost souls are kept. And now, you are one of us." The words sent a wave of cold through Elliot's body. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. The mirror seemed to draw him in, its surface rippling like water, as if it were alive, waiting for him to come closer. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the floor as he raced back down the hallway. The doors blurred past him, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Elliot! Elliot!" He reached the end of the hallway and stopped in front of a door that was slightly ajar. He didn't hesitate this time. He pushed it open, stepping into the room beyond. The room was dark, the only light coming from a faint, flickering candle on a small table in the center. The walls were bare, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. It was empty, save for the table and the candle. But as Elliot stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, his heart racing. The door was gone. In its place was a wall, smooth and featureless, as though the door had never existed. The room had changed. It was no longer the hallway, no longer the hotel. It was something else. A voice echoed in the darkness. "You've seen it now," it said, soft and low, like a whisper in the wind. "You've seen the truth." Elliot's pulse quickened. What truth? What is this place? The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, the room began to change. The walls began to shift, warping and twisting like the mirror had. The shadows stretched and twisted, forming shapes, faces, figures, people, all of them staring at him, their eyes hollow and empty. He realized with a sickening jolt that they were all staring at him. The lost souls, the ones who had been trapped here before him. And now, he was one of them. Elliot's breath quickened as the room shifted around him. The faces in the shadows seemed to press closer, their hollow eyes following his every movement. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the room itself was closing in on him. The walls rippled, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, like the heartbeat of the hotel itself. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the room, but there was no escape. The faces, the lost souls, moved closer, their mouths opening in silent screams, their hands reaching out toward him, their fingers twitching as if they were trying to pull him into the shadows. "Please," Elliot gasped, his voice barely a whisper, his hands shaking as he reached out for the door that no longer existed. "I don't belong here. Let me go." The faces didn't respond. They just stared at him, unblinking, as if waiting for something, waiting for him to understand. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the room, low and insistent. It wasn't the same voice that had spoken before. It was deeper, colder, more commanding. "You are here because you belong here," the voice said. "You have always belonged here." Elliot's mind spun. The words made no sense. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was just a traveler, a man who had wandered into a strange hotel, a place that should never have existed. But now everything was different. The hotel had claimed him. The room had claimed him. He was trapped. "No!" Elliot shouted, his voice cracking. "I won't stay. I won't become like them." The shadows shifted again, and the faces in the dark seemed to grow more intense, more real. The temperature in the room dropped, and he could see his breath in the cold air. The faces were no longer silent. They whispered, their voices overlapping, a chorus of voices that filled the room with a maddening, incomprehensible hum. "You are one of us now. The hotel calls. The door has closed." The whispers echoed in his mind, growing louder, until they drowned out everything else. Elliot's chest tightened as the faces moved closer, their eyes burning into him. He felt himself sinking into the shadows, pulled toward them, drawn into their cold embrace. "No!" Elliot screamed again, his voice hoarse. "I won't stay. I won't become part of this place." But it was too late. The shadows surged forward, and Elliot felt his body grow heavy, as though the room was pulling him into the walls themselves. His feet seemed to sink into the floor, his legs becoming numb. The faces surrounded him, their cold hands brushing against his skin, and he could feel their eyes on him, watching him, judging him. And then, just as he thought he might be swallowed whole, the room stopped moving. For a moment, there was silence. Elliot gasped for breath, his chest heaving as he looked around. The faces were gone. The shadows had receded. The room was still. But he wasn't alone. In the center of the room, where the table had been, there was now a mirror, just like the one from before, but this one was different. It was taller, its frame dark and twisted, the edges jagged like broken glass. The surface of the mirror was cloudy, as if it were reflecting a world that didn't belong to this one. Elliot's heart pounded as he stepped toward the mirror. His reflection was there, but it wasn't him. It was a version of him, distorted and twisted, his face contorted into a grotesque grin. The eyes were hollow, empty, like the faces in the shadows. The reflection moved, but not in the way Elliot did. It seemed to have a life of its own, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. And then it spoke. "You are me," the reflection said, its voice a distorted echo of his own. "And I am you. We are one now. You cannot escape. You will never escape." Elliot recoiled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The mirror, the hotel, they were alive, feeding on him, feeding on his fear. The reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was alive. It was a part of him now, just as the hotel had become a part of him. "You are the hotel's now," the reflection whispered, its voice low and sinister. "The room has claimed you. You cannot leave. You belong here." Elliot's chest tightened as the words sank in. He wasn't just trapped in the hotel. He had become part of it. His soul, his very essence, had been absorbed into the hotel's endless hunger. He could feel it now, the cold, the darkness, the emptiness that stretched out before him. It was as though the hotel had woven itself into his very being, like a parasite feeding on his mind, his body, his soul. The reflection smiled wider, its grin stretching impossibly wide. "You are home now, Elliot. This is where you belong." Elliot's body trembled, his mind racing as he struggled to understand what was happening. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The hotel was alive. It was feeding on him, consuming him, and now there was no escape. No way out. The reflection reached out, its fingers brushing against the surface of the mirror. The edges of the mirror seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. "Come to me," the reflection whispered, its voice soft and coaxing. "Come to me, and you will understand. You will see." Elliot's legs moved of their own accord, as if the reflection's voice had taken hold of him, pulling him toward the mirror. He wanted to resist. He wanted to fight, but the pull was too strong, the darkness too overwhelming. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold glass. And then the mirror shattered. The world around Elliot exploded into darkness. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting a different version of the room, each one more twisted than the last. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. He could feel the hotel, the very essence of it, pressing against him, suffocating him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness was too thick, too heavy, and the whispers were deafening. "Elliot, Elliot." And then he was falling through endless corridors, through doors that opened into nothingness. The hotel was no longer a place. It was a feeling, a presence, an entity that consumed everything in its path. And now it was consuming him. He reached out, his hands grasping at the air, but there was nothing to hold on to. The hotel had swallowed him whole, and there was no escape. The darkness enveloped him, and for the first time, Elliot understood. He wasn't just lost. He was home,